We should make a very clear distinction here that often when people are embittered and resentful and feel like they're victims, it's because really awful things have happened to them. Now, not always, but often. And so then the question is, well, if you're in a situation and something really awful is happened to you or has happened to you, then, well, why shouldn't you feel like a victim? And is there a better alternative? And part of what you were trying to lay out in this part of the book is what those better alternatives are. So part of looking for that hero is to find out from someone else's example. In your case, it was your mother, but these other sources that you described of people who were in a sort of hell in an undeniable sense, but who chose in a very real way to make it as good as it could possibly be given the circumstances. And so they had to turn to sources of power, let's say, and strength and fortitude and resilience that weren't, in some sense, obviously associated with the catastrophe. I mean, in your mother's case, it's a pretty tragic situation. She's a young mother, she has young kids, now she has breast cancer, and she fights a losing battle over a period of 5 years. That's pretty bad. And then you have to ask yourself, given that that's obviously pretty bad, how is it even possible that someone could handle that with not only grace and courage, but the kind of grace and courage that leaves their children with an immovable sense of the ability to prevail in the face of the deepest adversity. I mean, that's really something. You said here, thousands have come before you and they did just fine. So quit your complaining. And it's not because you have nothing to complain about. That's not the case. It's that that's not the right approach. The fact is, and this is such an optimistic fact, as well as a judgment in some sense, the fact is that if someone else can do it, so can you. And that's something, right? If you're reading about the great heroes in history, people who are in these terrible situations, and you see someone rise to the occasion, and then you can say, well, that was a person who did that, and I'm a person, and so maybe I have that capacity too, even though I don't know how to approach it. And then some of the rest of your book, much of the rest of your book, I would say in some sense is a guide to help people figure out how they could approach that. One of the things you point out first is, well, notice who you admire, and then maybe try consciously practicing becoming like that. When you see someone in the depths of genuine suffering, hopefully what you're trying to do is to throw a lifeline, and one possible lifeline is compassion. And that's probably the right lifeline to throw an infant, who's suffering, that sort of overwhelming compassion. But for someone who is an adult or making progress towards being an adult, the lifeline that might be thrown is there's something within you that would let you be more than you are, and much more, and maybe enough more so that you could actually deal with this suffering so it didn't turn into hell and take everything along with it. And there isn't anything more optimistic than that. You say something here, which I think is I'm going to read something from your book here. It is true that character is to some extent innate. I would say what that does is that it provides each of us with a range of talents and a range of temptations. And so it's something like that. So it's the hand we're dealt, and there's certainly a genetic element to that. Our genetic makeup imbues in us certain proclivities. But it is as true that character is mostly a consequence of choices. Strangely enough, we all make them, and we should make them deliberately, with the knowledge that these choices are part of our responsibility toward a purpose other than our own selfish aims. That responsibility is to your family, friends, community, and country. That's something that conservatives put forward as a pathway to virtue. And what's so interesting about that, as far as I'm concerned, as an antidote to atomistic liberalism, let's say, that hyper-privileges the individual, is that it's definitely been my observation as a clinical psychologist that in the depths of misery, the capability that you have to be of service to other people, your family, your friends, your community, your country, that's actually a saving grace under such circumstances. And that people really find a deep and abiding meaning in that service. So it's not just finger wagging and the pointing towards duty. It's like, no, you don't understand. that if you're in desperate straits, if your life has fallen apart, if you're nihilistic and miserable, and maybe you have your bloody reasons, because maybe you do, that's still the case that if you step outside yourself and you try to make the lives of other people better, that's the best possible thing that you can do for yourself.
Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. Some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number 1. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. That's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?
Let's say I was dealing with a client, and maybe that was somebody who, say a man, 35 years old, he still lived at home. So he was too dependent. His room was a complete bloody catastrophe. And, he's living like a bratty 13-year-old, and that gets pretty ugly by the time you're 35. And he knew it, and I'm sure his mother knew it, although obviously she put up with it, which was probably her mistake, at least in part. But maybe we decide, well, let's start by cleaning your room. And so as a cognitive behavioral psychologist, you engage in a process called collaborative empiricism. And that's partly to solve the problem that you described. Is, well, how do we know we set the right goal? Well, we say, well, go try it. And just watch yourself like you don't know who you are, and come back next week and we'll see how you did. And maybe, I remember this one client, he came back and he said, I went and got the vacuum cleaner from the closet, which is something I really never done, and I put that vacuum cleaner in the doorway of my bedroom, crossways, so it blocked the doorway, and then I just walked over it for a whole week. And look, he was completely nonplussed at his own intransigence, and look what he did, eh? He was so resentful and so angry that he instead of vacuuming his damn bedroom like he planned, he just stuck the vacuum in his own way and then martyred himself over it every day for a week. It's like, okay then, we're starting to get somewhere with the whole you living at home thing here. And so, well, that was too high a goal for him. And you say, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, he didn't do it, did he? So then what you do practically is you say, well, how about you bring that vacuum cleaner into your room this week, and that's your whole assignment. And just watch what happens when you bring it in. Watch the fantasies that flicker in the back of your mind as you live out your resentment at your therapist, daring to make you bring that vacuum across the threshold of your bedroom. And so if people catch those fantasies, whew, that's quite the bloody night and quite the revelation to themselves, I can tell you, because you have to be one angry person to put a vacuum cleaner in your doorway and walk over it every day for a week. And so then we get somewhere. It's like, okay, now we're getting to the bottom of things, but maybe the next week he'd come back, well, with the fantasies at hand and rather shocked as a consequence, but the vacuum cleaner was then in his room. And so he broke the threshold there, and then maybe all he could do was sort out a drawer or half a drawer, something like that. So what you do is, you pick a target that you think is probably reasonable, and you can negotiate that with yourself.
Imagine someone that you treat well, that you love. Then try to treat yourself that way. You got to detach from yourself a bit. You got to think, okay, well, I'm a person among other people, and I deserve at least as much respect as a person among other people, and I should be trying to help myself across time. And instead of being self-contemptuous and self-destructive, I need to take care of myself as if I'm potentially valuable, and to lay out my life that way. And so that's what that chapter is about. And it's hard for people, they don't take care of themselves as well as they should. And I don't mean, take care of yourself. I mean, that isn't what I mean. It's like, it's not a moralistic attack. It's an encouragement to give yourself a bit of the benefit of the doubt. Take care of your room, take care of your things, have some respect for yourself. It's like there is a lot of potential within you, and there's many things that you can do, and you're necessary more than you think to the unfolding of things. Like, if you make a bunch of bad decisions, things get worse, not just for you, things get worse. And so it matters what you do, and so part of what you do is you want to treat yourself as if what you do matters. And so you want to have some respect for yourself. Life has proximal meanings, right? There's the meaning that you experience when you're engaged in a piece of art, or when you're reading, or when you're engrossed in a movie or in a conversation. There's the meaning that emerges within your relationships with people that you cherish or are enthusiastic with. There's meanings of security and predictability. There's meanings of duty and responsibility and active engagement with your job and your career. There's meanings of aesthetic pleasure. Now, all of those have their value, and each of them has their place. And maybe there's a hierarchy of value there as well, so that some of those meanings are deeper than others. And then you might say, well, what characterized the deepest of all meanings? And it would be something like relationship with the transcendent, and that would establish a relationship between you and what's always been conceptualized as God, which is generally supposed to be something ineffable, right? It's not definable, but you might think about it as the central animating spirit of the age, or the value around which all other values are organized, or the wisdom of the ages, or the creative spirit that possesses you when you're inspired, or what grips you with enthusiasm at a sports event or at a musical event. All of those things. And we need a relationship with that. And we find our deepest meaning in that relationship. And if we don't find it, if we don't find it in something that's explicitly religious, then we tend to magnify something of lesser value, say something political, into that to fill the void. So yes, life has proximal meanings without God, without eternity, but at the ultimate level, something's lacking. And it's the desire to fulfill that lack that, and maybe the lack itself, that's part and parcel of the religious instinct. So you can kill God, but you can't. That doesn't rectify the hunger for God. And then that hunger seeks out replacements. That's how it looks to me. So, and then, you might also say, well, does that mean you have to believe in God? And I don't think of the proper answer to that is that you need to agree with a propositional statement. Does God exist? Yes. Like, is this table there? Yes. It's not that kind of relationship. I mean, it's characterized in the Old Testament as a struggle. So Israel means those who struggle with God. And you have to participate in that struggle. And you can do that, weirdly enough, as a believer or as a non-believer. Maybe sometimes more intensely as a non-believer. The issue might be more paramount then, the issue of virtue and the issue of the ultimate orientation. If you're plagued by bouts of depression and anxiety, that does destabilize your identity. So it's almost by definition. But having said that, look, this is when habit and plan and strategy are so useful. So in the periods of depression that I've had, and some of them were long and certainly the most unpleasant experiences of my life. This is when you need a philosophy, let's say, that's allied with your vision and your strategy to sustain you. Because what would happen to me is that, I have a vision, and I suppose the vision is of a world that's better, that's less likely to descend into ideological catastrophe, and where people are more responsible and more awake and more educated and healthier. All of that, a vision of a better world, a world that's less hellish at least, but also a better world, and some sense of what role I might play in that. And so that's very motivating. Like, it's a profound goal to try to make things better. And you can do that locally. You can do that for yourself. You can do that for your family. You can do that for the broader community. And all of that's worth it, man. It's worth making some sacrifices for. It's worth suffering for to some degree. And then you decompose that into the day-to-day and week-to-week strategies and actions that you're undertaking, the plans and the activities that you're putting forward to make that dream a reality, to realize it. And then when the depression and anxiety come along, you think, part of it with depression, it's just bloody endurance. It's like you get up and you work through the next hour, you try to stay on track, you try to implement your strategic plans to the best of your ability, and you hope and you pray that you'll get through it. You'll get through it, and that the darkness will recede, and you stay on track. You eat even though you're not hungry. You get up even though you want to stay in bed. You interact with people even though you'd rather be alone. And it's the benefit of disciplined habits can sustain you. It's like the boat you're rowing in through a terrible storm, leaks and all, and maybe you'll be overwhelmed, but you have the boat and you can row forward, and that's what you've got. How about this gentleman second from? Yes. John's got the mic there.
Thank you. I don't want to look behind me how many people are here because I'll get a bit nervous to ask this question. Also, this may not apply to many, so I expect your answer might be a bit short. I'm a vet and currently serving police officer in WA, and I've got PTSD, and I'm at the Marion Centre, which is a mental place, and they let me out today.
Oh, yeah?
Legally. I just wanted to ask you, how do I move from day-to-day hedonism and ideations and risk the hope and cautious optimism of a long-term life with the conditions I currently have, or for anybody who might be having complex PTSD and living day to day
Well, I mentioned this program that I have online, this self-authoring program. One thing you might try doing it. So so it's got 3 parts. The first part is a guided autobiography. And what it asks you to do is break your life down into 7 epochs and 7 stages. Sometimes people do that by relationship or by year or by occupation, however you choose. And then to detail out the most significant emotional events of your life, especially those that still hold some emotional valence. And that would help, because what happens with PTSD in some sense is that the narrative through which you see the world fractures. And because it fractures, your perceptions and your consequent emotional responses become chaotic. And that chaos produces a stress response, a chronic stress response. And so what you need to do to recover from PTSD is to knit the story back together. And I had a client who had PTSD, very seriously affected. She was only 17, and she was so fractured that she was diagnosed with severe schizophrenia. And when I first saw her, she could barely talk, and she could barely focus her eyes, and she would move her hands up and down, and I could, like she was grasping for something. And I asked her why, and she said that she could see lines in front of her and that she was trying to interact with them. I mean, when your perceptions are fractured, you're in pretty rough shape. And it turned out that she had been terribly bullied by a boy whose amorous advances she had rejected, and he set out to make her life hell, and certainly succeeded. And I had her walk through this past authoring program in the course of therapy. And she could hardly write to begin with. And we went through her life right from the beginning. And as we went through it, she got more and more coherent. And by the time we had brought her up to date, including walking through this catastrophic bout of bullying and the school's absolute inability to do anything about it, she had glued herself back together. So the other thing I would carefully recommend, especially if what traumatized you happened more than 18 months ago, is that you spend some time either writing about it, or another thing to try is just before you go to sleep, bring the memory to mind, and not enough to push you farther than you want to go, but as vividly as you can, and then let it go. Like, don't push yourself harder than you can. You'll see, you want to initiate a process of active engagement with the dragon that burned you, fundamentally. The psychophysiological pattern of active engagement is the opposite to the psychophysiological pattern of involuntary stress. And so if you can practice embodying that voluntary confrontation, then that stance can come to dominate. And that's the stance you want to dominate, because that moves you forward voluntarily into the world. And so, and that, in all probability, that will work. So I had this is a friend of mine. He had PTSD, and he had been brutalized in a Canadian residential school when he was a kid, and it was bloody rough, like Auschwitz level rough. It was really bad. You can't listen to his story without it like breaking down, it's bad. And he told me that he hadn't looked in a mirror for 40 years. He was unable to face himself, And he also told me that when he dreamed, he was still 8 years old in his dreams, same age he was when the cataclysm occurred. And that he had started to become aware that he was stuck in his dream. He's kind of a visionary guy. He's an artist, this guy. And so I suggested that he spend a little bit of time in front of the mirror each night before he went to bed, just taking a glance at himself. Because he had not looked at himself for so long he didn't even know how old he was. Because so what happened in his dreams, this was so cool, he started to age in his dreams. So instead of being stuck at 8, then he was 10, and then he was 12, and eventually, he did this for a number of months, eventually he got as old in his dreams as he was in real life. And what that meant, like imagine your dream image is it's the representation of yourself in imagination. And if it's stuck 50 years in the past, then your self-concept is in some sense hasn't been updated for that period of time. Just that process of voluntary engagement, which was him being willing to look at himself in the mirror despite his shame, his deep shame at what had happened to him, that was enough to pull him back together. So that should work. That should work, you know. The other thing with PTSD, it's also very useful to develop something approximating a sophisticated philosophy of good and evil, because people generally have PTSD because they've been struck by something malevolent. And so it's not just tragedy, there's malevolence in it. Reading, there's a couple of books I'd recommend. One is called Ordinary Men. It's about a police battalion in Germany who was trained to do heinous things in World War II. It's a great book, Ordinary Men. It's a great book. And another one I would recommend is called The Rape of Nanking. And these are rough books, man. The woman who wrote The Rape of Nanking, she committed suicide. It's a rough book. But the utility of the books is that they universalize malevolence. So almost everybody who's traumatized has been either touched by their own malevolence or by witnessing it or being subject to it at the hands of someone else. And one of the consequences of that is that if you don't have an advanced philosophy of good and evil, you have no place to put the contact with malevolence. Part of the utility of the doctrine of original sin was the universalization of malevolence. So, you know, you might say, and it's true, that there's a little bit of Hitler in all of us, and there's a little more than a little bit, you can be sure of that. And that's a pretty cataclysmic realization. And you might say, well, how can you bear that self-understanding or the revelation of that kind of malevolence in the world? And the answer is, in part, by understanding it as part of the eternal conditions of existence. You know, the idea that the state, the sovereign of the state has an evil uncle, that's an idea as old as time. So for the Egyptians, that was Set. And the sun sets, by the way, because the spirit of Set is what devours the sun at night. And Set is the root word for Satan. And so even the ancient Egyptians knew that malevolence that it was worthwhile contemplating the existence of malevolence as an independent spirit. And that allows you to take responsibility in some sense for the existence of malevolence in your own life, but it also universalizes it so that it's not exactly about you, right? It's more a reflection of the structure of existence as such. And that can allow you to detach yourself from it a little bit, and that can be extremely useful too.
But you know, I had this crazy professor that I met at the University of Alberta when I was about 18, and he was quite the bizarre person. He vanished one day about 20 years later. He got on a bus in Winnipeg and to go visit his family and never showed up, and they never found a trace of him. Anyways, at the University of Alberta, he worked as the psychologist at the maximum security prison that was located nearby, and he took me out there a couple of times, and so that was quite the hair-raising experience. And I met some pretty serious psychopaths in the Edmonton maximum security prison. And he was a funny guy. This Stauberger was his name. He used to give us multiple choice tests. He did a course on creativity, and now and then he'd throw in a multiple choice test question, and all 4 answers would be the same, which I thought was, that was creative, and it was certainly funny, I thought. And you know, some of the students really hated him, but I thought he was great. He was really cool. And what did he say about suicide? You can always do it tomorrow.
Yeah, well, that's pretty good. It's pretty good. That's a pretty good piece of advice. It's like, you know, you don't get to do it twice if you're successful. So, is it not possible just to wait? Can you just wait? And that's pretty generic advice, but it's definitely worth thinking about, because it's final act. And I would say too, let people around you know. You don't want to keep that a secret. And if you don't have anyone to tell, really it's time to go to the hospital and tell someone. And you tell, when you go to the hospital, you say, I'm suicidal. And I have a plan, and here's my plan. And that's, by the way, how you assess someone for suicidality, because depressed people, lots of people get depressed, will have suicidal thoughts, and they're far from rare. And so then you might ask yourself, well, how do you know when someone's suicidal? And they're suicidal when they say to you, you say, well, do you ever think self-destructive thoughts? And they say, yeah, in my father's house, there's a basement and there's a pistol down there, and it's in the top right-hand corner of the bureau, and I know the bullets for that gun are in the bottom left-hand drawer, and I've taken that gun out of that drawer and I've toyed with it, and I thought, my parents are leaving next week for a weekend, and they won't be back, and I could go into the bathroom and put the barrel in my mouth and end it. It's like, that's a suicidal person. And you know that because they're not just being plagued by vague thoughts. They have a fully detailed, implementable vision of their death. And that's not good. And so if there's anybody in the audience who has that sort of fully fleshed out fantasy, I would say, tell someone, or more than one person. Tell the closest person you have to someone who cares. And if you don't have anybody to tell, then go to the hospital and tell them. Because the probability is pretty high if you're suicidal that there's actually something wrong with you, that you're ill in some manner, and maybe you're depressed, but there's a lot of reasons to be depressed. Sometimes you might be depressed because you just have a terrible life, and that's very complicated. But sometimes you're depressed because you have an immunological condition, an inflammatory condition, or you're ill in some way that hasn't been diagnosed, or you have seasonal affective disorder and your circadian rhythms are off. Like, there's a lot of reasons that you can get desperate enough to be suicidally depressed, and there's always the possibility that that can be fixed. And it's tricky, because when you're depressed, you definitely think that the future is dismal, and the past is dismal, and the present is unbearable, and the future is definitely worse, and it's all your fault besides. And that's basically the depressive cloud. It affects everything. It's very low level, profound, deep brain and psychic state. But it's generally rectifiable. And, since you can always do it tomorrow, you might as well run the whole gamut of treatments before you make the final decision. So that's what I would tell people who are... Oh, and the other thing too, you got to understand too about suicide is that if there are people around you that love you, it's pretty likely that they'll never really recover. And so, you might be thinking that if you took yourself out, you'd be doing the people around you a favor, and often people who are depressed, they really believe that. But, I've had lots of clients who were pretty damn traumatized by a familial suicide, and they just torture themselves for the rest of their life thinking, what if... Well, I had one client, for example, her relative committed suicide an hour after she missed a phone call from him. It's like, how the hell do you recover from that, Because you just think, well, if I would have just been there, and then you can't talk to the person about it. There's no real way of rectifying that. You just live with that guilt, and it's a pretty damn awful thing. That's why most societies regard suicide as a crime, because you leave an aftermath of catastrophic destruction in your wake, and that's also not a good thing. So, if you're depressed, you're going to think it's going to be better for everyone else if you're just gone, but generally that's far from the truth. almost inevitably it's far from the truth. So those are some things you need to know on the suicide analysis and prevention front. There are people who are neurologically damaged, who have physiological reasons for difficulty in maintaining optimized attentional focus. You see that in people, for example, who have fetal alcohol syndrome. Most of the time, as far as I'm concerned, it's a rubbish diagnosis. Panksepp, the same neuroscientist that I talked to you about, who investigated play behavior in rats, also noted, this is quite fun, that if you deprive juvenile male rats of the opportunity to play boisterously, they become hyperactive. And also, if you deprive them of the opportunity to play optimally, their prefrontal cortices do not mature well. And the prefrontal cortex matures late, and it constitutes, in some sense, the pinnacle of neurological development, and it needs to develop in the course of intense play. And then he noticed that if you administered hyperactive play-deprived rats amphetamine, Ritalin, that it would inhibit their frenetic playing. And that's pretty much what's happening in schools. So the schools are not well adapted to boys. I don't think they're particularly well adapted to girls either, by the way, but they're particularly not well adapted to boys. Boys aren't designed to sit still and be bored out of their skulls for 7 hours a day. And there are boys with particular temperaments who are even less inclined to be able to do that. So, for example, if you're extroverted, highly social, possessed by a fair bit of enthusiasm and positive emotion, then you're going to appear more hyperactive. If you're creative, then your attention is going to be fragmented in some sense by the multiplicity of your interests. So if you're creative and extroverted, then you have both of those working against you in terms of your quiescent adaptation to the school environment. If you're disagreeable, which is also more likely if you're male, then you're quite likely to push back against what you see as stupid, arbitrary rules. And so we know perfectly well, for example, that attention deficit disorder overlaps with childhood conduct disorder and antisocial behavior. And I'm not saying that all children diagnosed with hyperactivity are conduct disordered. I'm saying that more aggressive boys tend to manifest symptoms that sometimes tilt them towards juvenile criminality and sometimes tilt them towards attention deficit disorder and hyperactivity. But it's partly their somewhat rebellious temperament. And so if you're disagreeable and extroverted and creative, then why wouldn't you be hyperactive? When amphetamines were first used to treat hyperactivity, the hypothesis was the following. Kids who are hyperactive or attention deficit disordered are of a different neurological type. Now, as I said, in rare circumstances, that's true. But absent evidence for neurological dysfunction, I would hesitate to make that presumption. The run-of-the-mill hyperactive boy, if you put him on amphetamines, Ritalin, his attentional focus improves. Now, the original hypothesis was that's because these abnormally neurologically structured hyperactive boys have a paradoxical reaction to amphetamine administration. It calms them down, whereas with normal people, they become more stimulated, okay? There's a word for that theory, and the word is wrong. Okay, so more intelligent and differentiated analysis has indicated that if you give any child amphetamines, the grip of what they're attending to is stronger. So all children are calmed down by stimulants perversely, because the psychomotor stimulant, which is a dopamine agonist, which activates the focal exploratory system, does increase the capacity for focal attention. But it does that with all children. And so a positive reaction to amphetamine in relationship to attentional focus is no indication whatsoever, even in the most minute manner, that the diagnosis was correct. And so I don't buy it, except in these rare cases, is that we use amphetamines to conveniently modify the behavior of bored boys, because we're too stupid to construct our education systems in a manner that doesn't drive them mad. Look, you know, normal university students take Ritalin like mad in university, because they learn that they can sustain attention. Whether that's productive or not in the long run is a whole different issue, but they can sustain attention with less effort if they use amphetamines. Now, that's a degenerating game, fundamentally, like most drug use. And I suppose if it's very carefully regulated and the doses are low, then the negative consequences are less dramatic. But I think the whole thing's just, it's a psychosocial fraud. It's a, what do they call that? When a system produces there's a name for a disease that's created by doctors. I can't remember it. What's the word? Iatrogenic? Iatrogenic? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, hyperactivity is an iatrogenic disease created by schools. Yeah, that's the case. So boys should play more, way more than they do, way more. They should play to the point of exhaustion in some sense every day. Really, really. They'll quit when they've had enough.
Sit on your bed one day and ask yourself, what remarkably stupid things am I doing on a regular basis to absolutely screw up my life? And if you actually ask that question, but you have to want to know the answer, right? Because that's actually what asking the question means. It doesn't mean just mouthing the words. It means you have to decide that you want to know. You'll figure that's out so fast it'll make your hair curl. There's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. And then you might also ask yourself, and this is definitely worth asking, is do you really have anything better to do? And if you don't, well, why would you do anything else? If you orient yourself properly and then pay attention to what you do every day, that works. And I actually think that that's in accordance with what we have come to understand about human perception, because what happens is that the world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. And so you have an aim. Well, let's say your aim is the highest possible aim. Well then, so that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim, and then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems, and if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim, and you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning. That's how, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life. Well, and then the issue is, well, back to Noah, well, all hell's about to break loose and chaos is coming. It's like when that's happening in your life, you might want to be doing something that you regard as truly worthwhile, because that's what will keep you afloat when everything is flooded. And you don't want to wait until the flood comes to start doing that, because if your ark's half built and you don't know how to captain it, the probability is very high that you'll drown. Ask and it shall be given you, seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. For everyone that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. That sounded pretty optimistic again, but again, I think it's a description of the structure of existential reality, and by which I mean, when I'm in my clinical practice and I observe, and this is also the case with my students, is, let's say people's lives aren't what they would like them to be, and so then you ask, why? Well, forget about tragedy and catastrophe, because that's self-evident and we're not going to discuss that, although the degree to which you bring about your own tragedy is always indeterminate. But I would never say that every terrible thing that is visited on a person is something they deserved. I think that that's a very dangerous presupposition, especially because everyone gets sick and everyone dies. But one of the main reasons that people don't get what they want is because they don't actually figure out what it is. And the probability that you're going to get what would be good for you, let's say, which would even be better than what you want, right? Because, you know, you might be wrong about what you want easily, but maybe you could get what would really be good for you. Well, why don't you? Well, because you don't try. You don't think, okay, here's what I would like if I could have it. And I don't mean in a way that you manipulate the world to force it to deliver you goods for status or something like that. That isn't what I mean. I mean something like, imagine that you were taking care of yourself like you were someone you actually cared for. And then you thought, okay, I'm caring for this person. I would like things to go as well for them as possible. What would their life have to be like in order for that to be the case? Well, people don't do that. They don't sit down and think, all right, you know, let's figure it out. You've got a life. It's hard, obviously. It's like 3 years from now, you can have what you need. You got to be careful about it. You can't have everything. You can have what would be good for you, but you have to figure out what it is, and then you have to aim at it. Well, my experience with people has been is, if they figure out what it is that would be good for them, and then they aim at it, then they get it. And it's strange because they don't it's a strange thing. It's not quite that simple, because, you know, you may formulate an idea about what would be good for you, and then you take 10 steps towards that and you find out that your formulation was a bit off, and so you have to reformulate your goal. You know, so you're kind of going like this as you move towards the goal. But a huge part of the reason that people fail is because they don't ever set up the criteria for success. And so, since success is a very narrow line and very unlikely, the probability that you're going to stumble on it randomly is 0. So there's a proposition here, and the proposition is, if you actually want something, you can have it. Now the question then would be, well, what do you mean by actually want? And the answer is that you reorient your life in every possible way to make the probability that that will occur as certain as possible. And that's a sacrificial idea, right? It's like, you don't get everything, obviously, but maybe you can have what you need. And maybe all you have to do to get it is ask. But asking isn't a whim or today's wish. It's like, you have to be deadly serious about it. You have to think, okay, like, I'm taking stock of myself. And if I was going to live properly in the world, and I was going to set myself up such that being would justify itself in my estimation, and I don't mean as a harsh judge, exactly what is it that I would aim at? And so the issue is not so much the blindness of others, even though there's as much blindness among others as there is for you. But the issue here, the advice here, the description here is, you should be concerned about what's interfering with your own vision first. And you should leave other people the hell alone in relationship to that. And so if your mode of being in the world is, if you would just act better, things would improve for me. Or if you identify the evil and the catastrophe as something that's outside, that someone else needs to fix, or that someone else is responsible for, then you're not going to fix that, and you're going to remain blind to the things that you're doing and not doing that make things not go well. And so it's just better to think, all right, I'm probably blind in many, many ways, and maybe there are some ways that I could rectify that, because it's highly probable that you're blind in all sorts of ways. I mean, in fact, it's virtually certain. And so it's just more useful to think, how is it that I'm wrong in this situation? Here's some items, so you guys can do a quick big 5 on yourselves, and I'll tell you the upside and downside of it. So if you're orderly, you follow a schedule. How many of you follow a schedule? Okay, and how many of you don't? Okay, so one thing I would recommend is that you do. And I'll tell you why. Like, intelligence is a very good predictor of academic performance. And there's not a lot you can do about your intelligence. I mean, you can squander it, but it's very difficult to improve it. Conscientiousness, well, it's a trait too, so it's hard to work on, but we know that conscientious people get better grades, and it's reliable, and it's a powerful effect. And so if your time use is organized, then the probability that you're going to be successful is very high. So one of the things you might think about is make friends with a calendar, like Google Calendar or something like that. And I can tell you some tricks about that, because really it is important. Like, and I'm not kidding around about this. If you're low in conscientiousness, it's really going to trip you up as you walk through life. There's not very many advantages to it that I've been able to see, and I'm not assuming that just because you don't follow a schedule you're low in conscientiousness, but it is one of the items that mark it. The advantage I've seen so far to being unconscientious is that if you become unemployed, it doesn't bother you as much. And I mean, that actually turns out to matter in some situations. So, like, you know, if a big company has to shed 50% of its employees, it's the conscientious people are going to suffer themselves to death for it. And the unconscientious people, they're not going to care anyways, because they weren't working anyway. So it doesn't matter if they have a job or not. So here's one way of thinking about making use of a schedule. Often people are afraid of schedules because they think of them as a trap. You know, you make a schedule and it's like this little prison that you have to live inside, and you know, and all you're doing in your schedule is putting down things you have to do or should do, and so, you know, there's not a lot of fun in that. And so not only is it a trap or a prison, but it's kind of an unpleasant one. But a way to work with the schedule in a lot more sophisticated way is to think, well, I'm going to plan the next week, say, because you plan it day by day, but we'll take the week as the unit level of analysis and think, well, I'd like to plan a week I'd like to have. And then your schedule all of a sudden becomes a tool for increasing the quality of your life. And that's a whole different issue, you know, because you might think, what's the emotion that you suffer, assuming you suffer one of these emotions? If you have an essay that's due and you're not doing it, like, would you regard that as a pleasant emotion or unpleasant emotion? Okay, so do you think you can characterize the unpleasantness? Like, what kind of emotion is it? It's guilt. Okay, anything else? Frustration? Yeah, so you're sort of frustrated with yourself. Yeah, you need a slap, right? You think, I need a slap. So, okay, so guilt, anything else? Anxiety? Restlessness? So that's kind of an agitation. Yeah, it's because your body knows you should be doing something, but you know, you're not pointing it in the right direction, so it's shame? Is that reasonable? So, okay, so the reason I was asking you about that is because, you know, most of the negative emotions are associated with neuroticism, but some of them seem to be associated with conscientiousness. And the conscientious negative emotions seem to be guilt and shame, fundamentally. And so recent research, and really recent, I only got this paper like a week ago, I think it's about 4 months old, seem to indicate that conscientious people feel less guilt, but they're more guilt prone. So if they don't do something, that makes them guilty, but they organize their time so they are doing the things they're supposed to do, so then they don't feel guilty. So anyways, back to the schedule. So all right, you think about your week and you think about your day, and you think, well, how would you improve the quality of a given day or a given week? Well, one of the ways of improving it is to not put yourself into the situation where there are things hanging over your head that you have to feel guilty and ashamed about, because that's a very unpleasant way of being. And you know, if you have an essay that's due in a week and you're procrastinating, then the fact that you have to do that essay can ruin the whole week. And even when you're doing something that's positive, hypothetically, it's kind of that horrible kind of positive that you experience when you know that you should be doing something else. And so that's when you end up watching YouTube videos about like dancing cats or something like that. You know, and it's at best it's a guilty pleasure. It's not a pleasure at all. You think like, what the hell am I doing watching videos of dancing cats, you know? But then you know that you're procrastinating, and that's low quality, very low quality existence. So if you use your schedule, you can think, okay, well, here's some times that I'm going to do this work. And then you can also sort of ask yourself about that when you're designing your schedule. Because you don't want to design a schedule like you're Adolf Hitler telling yourself what to do, you know, because you're not going to comply with it then. What you have to do if you're going to design a schedule is you have to ask yourself, all right, I'm going to set aside some time to study over the next week or to do this essay or whatever it is. How much time would I actually spend studying? An hour or two a day might be a worthwhile thing to schedule in, and I would say don't schedule in more than that to begin with, because then you'll fail and then you'll stop using the schedule. And so the other thing you want to do is you want to schedule in things that you want to do, and then you want to look at the day or the week and you want to think, hey, that's a week I'd like to have. If I had a week like that, it would be good. You know, I'd be caught up so that all that negative emotion doesn't have to accrue. And I would have done a bunch of things that I'm interested in doing, and at the end of the week I'd be in better shape than I was at the beginning. And if you treat a schedule like that, so that what you're using it is to design the days and weeks that you want to have, instead of using it as this little, you know, jail that you have to put yourself in that you're not going to do anyways, then you can learn to use them. And that's one thing you can do to make yourself more industrious, more conscientious. Follow a schedule.
I've told people to learn to use a schedule, and people often hate schedules because they act as their own tyrants, right? They say, well, you have to do this unpleasant thing, and then here's another unpleasant thing you have to do, and then you have to do this unpleasant thing, and you do that for about 3 days, and you think, to hell with this, I'm not doing that, you know, and you fall off the wagon. That isn't what you're supposed to do with a schedule. You're supposed to use it to design the days that you would like to have if you were taking care of yourself. And so some of that is, you know, you wake up in the morning and you think, here's 5 things I have to do that if I don't do, my life will be worse. It's like paying bills, for example, or taking out the garbage. It's like you have to do those because otherwise things degenerate. So you got to put some of those in the schedule, because otherwise tomorrow is worse than today, and that's a bad trajectory. But you also want to build in things, you know, you've got to act in some sense like you're dealing with a relatively recalcitrant 9-year-old. It's like, so, well, here's some things you have to do, but here's some things that if you do, you could reward yourself with. And if you get the balance there between obligation and reward right, then you'll find that you're motivated to do the things. And that's what you want to do. You want to do that so it's sustainable across days and weeks and months. And so you got to treat yourself like a good boss would treat a valued employee, and not like a tyrant would treat a slave, because the slave will rebel. And, you know, people say, well, I don't follow through on my plans. It's like, well, A, they're probably not very well formulated, and maybe you're doing them because of an external moral obligation or something. They're not really your plans, right? And B, you're acting like a tyrant and a slave, and that's a bad relationship to have with yourself. Treat other people as you would like to be treated. It works both ways. You also treat yourself like you treat other people properly. So that's a necessary thing, and often people don't do that. But the scheduling is really important.
Make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with the schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. It's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, you know, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that, and obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig, you dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. Plan a life you'd like to have, and you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to beat. But my point is that you have to understand that you're not your own servant, so to speak. You're someone that you have to negotiate with, and you're someone that you want to present the opportunity of having a good life to. And that's hard for people because they don't like themselves very much. So, they're always like cracking the whip and then procrastinating, and cracking the whip and then procrastinating. And it's like, God, it's so boring and such a pathetic way of spending your time. And you know what that's like, because you probably waste like 6 hours a day. And I think we did an economic calculation about that a while back, right? Your time's probably worth $50 an hour, something like that. I mean, you're not getting paid that now, but you're young, and so this is investment time, and what you do now is going to multiply its effects in the future. So let's say it's $50 an hour, which is perfectly reasonable. So if you waste 6 hours a day, and you are, then you're wasting about $2,000 a week, or about $100,000 a year. So like, go ahead, but that's what it's costing you every hour. And you need to know what your damn time is worth. So let's say it's not $50, it's 30, whatever. Maybe it's 100, it's somewhere in that range. One of the things you should be asking yourself is, when you spend an hour, was that, well, would have I paid someone $50 to have had that hour? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, maybe you should do something else with your time. And it depends on whether or not you think that your time's worthwhile. But the funny thing about not assuming that is, if you assume your time isn't worthwhile, what happens is you don't just sit around sort of randomly in a state of responsibilityless bliss. What you do is you suffer existentially. I called the course Personality and Its Transformations, and I think you could think about that as a restatement of the idea of being and becoming. And that's what you are. You're, for whatever that means, you're an entity that both is and is transforming. And there's a rule that goes along with that, by the way, which is, don't sacrifice who you could be for who you are. Which means if you have to choose to transform in a positive direction or maintain your current position, then it's better to transform in a positive direction. So you might even think of that as the core of your being. That's a Piagetian idea. It's a Jungian idea as well. Who are you? You're the thing that transforms who you are. Now, you're also who you are, but on top of that, you're the thing that transforms who you are. And I do think that that's not an arbitrary statement. One of the things that modern universities do dreadfully now is convince their students that value structures are relative, and that's a big mistake. There's a lot of things wrong with that idea, and one of the things that's wrong with that idea is that doesn't include what I just mentioned, which is that's a good moral rule, is you are the thing that is and you're the thing that becomes, and you should put the thing that becomes at a higher place than the thing that is. That means you also have to allow yourself to shake off those things about you that you might be pathologically attached to, habits and people for that matter, ways of thinking, all of those things. You have to allow yourself to shake those off, and that's more like a burning. That's why the phoenix is the symbol that it is, right? It's old and it deteriorates, it bursts into flame, and then it's reborn. It's like, well, do you want to be reborn? It's like, well, that's not the question. The question is, do you want to burst into flame? And the answer to that generally is no, but that's the wrong answer. The right answer is you let all that nonsense burn away. And you might say, well, I don't know what I should leave behind. And the answer to that is, that's a lie. You know some of the things that you should leave behind. All you have to do is ask yourself. You'll come up with a list instantly of 100 stupid things that you're doing that you know you could stop doing. Some of them maybe you don't know you could stop doing. It's like, well, fine, leave those alone for now. But there's a bunch of things you perfectly know well that you could stop doing that would improve your life. And so do that, see what happens. That's a good idea. All right, so it's personality and its transformations, because partly I wanted to talk to you about what you are as a human being and also as an individual, but also what you could become. And that's actually a crucial question in the domains of clinical psychology in particular, because a lot of what you're doing with people as a clinician is trying to figure out who they could become. That's right, you have a problem, your life isn't what it could be. It's like, fine, let's see what it could be like if we changed it. We'll figure out how to change it. That's got to be a negotiated dialogue, right? Because like, I don't know what the hell you should do with your life. I can help you figure it out, maybe we can talk about it, but you are the person who has to decide if the things that you're aiming for, get you out of bed in the morning, because that's at least one of the crucial issues. So you got to specify the goal, and then you got to specify the transformation processes and start practicing them. And you have to understand that you're going to be bad at it, but it doesn't matter, because bad's fine. Persistent is what you need to be. If you persist with tiny improvements, if you persist, you win. So okay, so in a broader context, you can think about this as a more fundamental ontological question. So one question is how you should act in the world. The other question is, well, what is the world? And that's a complicated problem. This is a scientific answer to that question, and that is that the world is a collection of objective phenomena, and that's a very powerful perspective. And we have a good method for determining what the world is like as a collection of objective phenomena. And that's made us very technologically powerful, and so more power to us and all that, but leaves a question unanswered. And the question is, well, the world isn't just a place of objective phenomena, because it's not a panoply of inert matter. It has living conscious creatures in it, and they're a different order of being. And the fundamental issue for conscious active creatures is not what is the world from an objective perspective, but how it is that you should conduct yourself in the world. And there's a kind of unbridgeable gap between those two domains of inquiry. And I think the reason for that is that the scientific method removes value from its descriptions. That's actually what it does. And so once you're left with value-free descriptions, it's very difficult to extract out a value proposition from them, because that's the scientific method removes the value propositions. You're supposed to be left with only that which is objective, right? And value propositions are in the domain of the subjective. So I think the idea that you can derive what you should be or do from a collection of facts is flawed, A, because collecting the facts themselves gets rid of the value structure, but B, there's an infinite number of facts, and so how are you going to pick which ones should guide you? You can't. You have to do something else. The facts do not tell you what to do with the facts. You need something else to help you figure that out. Well, it's come to me over the years that that's what the narrative cognitive framework does. It's the framework that we use to specify how we should act in the world. And so you could divide the world into the world as it is and the world as perhaps it should be. That gives you some direction, and you need that, and we know this technically, right? You need direction. The reason for that is it's direction that produces primary positive emotion. And so if you need positive emotion to move through life, which you do, because you can't even move without positive emotion, and also positive emotion is a good bulwark against terror and pain. If you need those things, then you need direction, you need a goal, you need a value structure. So that doesn't seem particularly disputable to me. You could still say, well, what value structure? It's like, okay, fine, that's a good question. But I've thought a lot about that too. So if we're going to adopt a value structure, there's a couple of rules that go along with it. And this is why the bloody postmodernists are wrong, as far as I can tell, is A, it can't just be my value structure, because I'm stuck with you. And we're both stuck with all these other people. And so if I'm going to lay out a value structure, which is a way of interpreting the world, let's say, and there's an infinite number of potential ways of interpreting the world, it's like, yeah, fine, no problem, except that I have to interpret the world in a way that I can use while I'm dealing with you, and while the two of us are dealing with everyone else, and while all of you are dealing with everyone else. And so that's the Piagetian game proposition. If you want to be a popular kid on the playground, you better play games that other people want to play. That's a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant observation. And I told you that Piaget was trying to heal the rift between science and religion, and that's one of the things that he did that he thought helped do that. The question is, well, where do moral judgments come from? Well, they emerge as a consequence of consensus, and it's a bounded domain. If we're going to occupy the same space for any length of time, and those are two critical propositions, the same space and a long time, then we have to figure out how to play an iterative game that doesn't spiral downward, hopefully that might even improve, that we both don't object to, because otherwise it's not going to work, right? You'll walk away and play another game, or the game will disintegrate catastrophically. So there's massive social constraint on what constitutes an appropriate frame of reference. So much for the relativist argument. And then there's another issue that's equally relevant, and it's associated with the idea of objective reality to some degree. But that's not exactly correct, because it's not exactly objective reality. Let's say that you and I decide to occupy the same place for some substantial amount of time, and we figured out how to solve the problem of being together. But you and I still have to figure out how to solve the problem of being together in a manner that doesn't make the world object too much. And it isn't just other people, although that's a huge part of the world. You want them to not object. You may even want them to support you. That would even be better. But you also have to deal with the tendency of matter to object. Because so your mode of being in the world, your interpretive framework, as a description of how you should act, is actually the laying out of a strategy that will produce the ends that it predicts, which are the things that you want. So this is the pragmatist perspective. This was worked out by William James and his people back in the late 1800s in New England, the only genuine brand of American philosophy. And what the pragmatist said is, how do you decide if something's true? The answer is, how the hell can you? You don't know anything. Well, that's true, but that isn't helpful, because there you're stuck with the problem of how to be in the world. Well, so what you do is you lay out a mode of interpretation that has an endpoint. And then you run the mode of interpretation, embodied, right, because you act it out. And if it doesn't produce the outcome, then it's not, well, let's say, true. The claims within it they're not true by the definition of the game itself. So you might say, well, you're a kid on a playground. You want to play a game. One of the implicit demands is that the game is fun. If it's not fun, it's not worth playing. So you play it for a while, and then you see, well, was that fun? If the answer is yes, then you keep playing the game. You say, well, that game it's good enough, it's accurate enough, it's true enough. And so you lay out interpretations in the world, and they're subject to massive constraints. Other people have to go along with them and cooperate with you, because if they don't, then look the hell out, like it's a major, serious, non-trivial constraint. And then the other thing is, well, social proof isn't good enough. It also has to work in the world outside of the social world. So if you have an illness and you have some hypothesis about how to construe it, you might say, well, is my understanding of the illness correct? Well, it implies that I take these actions. Well, how do you know if it's correct? Well, you take the actions, and if the illness gets worse, then by the definitions that are implicit in the framework of reference that you're using, you've made an error. And so there's no relativism in that. You could still say, well, there's a lot of potential solutions to any potential set of problems. It's like, yeah, there's lots of different ways to play chess. on a single board. Right, but that doesn't mean that any old solution is as good as any other solution. It doesn't mean that at all. So, okay, so then we're looking at things two ways. We're trying to figure out, well, how does the world present itself, and then how is it that you should act in it? And so, well, there's other constraints on the mechanisms of interpretation that you place in the world. So we could say, well, you're constrained in your interpretations by the constraints that other people place on you. But there's internal constraints as well. We talked about those mostly from a biological perspective, because you could also regard yourself in some sense as a loose internal society. And that's sort of a psychoanalytic dictum, right? You're a collection of sub-personalities, or you could say you're a collection of sub-routines. I don't care how you formulate it, but you're a unity, but you're a unity that brings together a plurality of subcomponents. And part of the constraints on how it is that you lay out your interpretation of the world is that you have to satisfy those internal subsystems, right? So you're the ego, but it's more like you're the captain of a ship full of people who are rowing. You got to keep the people rowing. You're not tyrant. You're not omnipotent tyrant of your own destiny. You're constrained by the nature of your own being. And so you have to provide yourself with food, and you have to provide yourself with shelter, and you have to provide yourself with water, and all of these things. And those are demands that are laid on you by the nature of your internal processes. And of course, how they lay themselves out as demands and what the appropriate solutions to that is, to those problems are, is debatable infinitely. But you can see the constraints stack up. You have to satisfy your internal constraints. So they have to be brought into a unity. That seems to happen, at least in part, but between the ages of 2 and something like between the ages of birth and 4 years old, maybe even 2 years old. You bring yourself together into something that's sort of functioning as a unity. Then you have to turn that unity into a unity that can function in the social world with increasing breadth. And that unity in the social world has to be a unity that can function inside the natural world. It's something like that. So you're stacking up these games into a hierarchy of increasing complexity. And one of the questions that emerges from that is, well, what should be at the top of the hierarchy? If it's a hierarchical structure, it has to be a hierarchical structure because some things have to be worth doing more than others, or you can't act, which is another thing I really don't like about the postmodernist ethos, because it claims that value structures are there to eliminate, to exclude and oppress, and never once notices that, well, yeah, fair enough, but value structures are also there so that you know which way to walk, because you can't figure out which way to walk without saying that that direction is preferable to that direction. So you're stuck with the damn things. And they do exclude. Obviously, category structures exclude. The question is, if you're going to have a value structure, how is it that it should be constituted? Well, I already described some of the constraints. Like if your value structure is perfectly functioning except that you don't get enough to eat, that turns out actually to be a fatal problem, right? And it might be, you can run into all sorts of fatal problems. You're too lonesome. Well, it means let's say that your value structure is too narcissistic. There's lots of reasons to be lonesome, but that might be one of them. Or you're too timid or something like that. Like you're going to be informed by your own internal biological mechanisms when the value structure that you're laying out in the world is insufficient to keep itself propagating across time. And some of that's just you, and some of that's other people, and some of that's the natural world. Constraints galore. And so in the face of all those constraints, it's absolutely unreasonable to say any old solution goes. Just try it. Generate a random solution. Run it as a simulation in the world. And see how many slings and arrows come your way. There'll be plenty. And you might say, well, I don't care about slings and arrows. It's like, yeah, no. That's a claim you don't get to make. So, okay, so you're being informed internally as to the nature of your value structure. You have to specify where you are. You have to specify where you're going. You have to integrate all your underlying biological mechanisms into that schema. It's something I think that's actually kind of weak about the Piagetian idea, say, because Piaget, I'm a great fan of Piaget, but Piaget tended to think that the child came into the world with nothing but a set of reflexes. I mean, that's his technical claim, and that you bootstrap off those reflexes, and I think it underestimates the degree to which the child comes into the world as an already prepared unit. And I mean, he just thought of those things as so self-evident that you don't need to talk about them, but that's actually not true. You do need to talk about them. We know, for example, that if you provide children with food and shelter, and adequate food and shelter, but you don't interact with them socially, almost all of them die in the first year, right? It's not optional Touch is not optional for children. Attention is not optional for children. Play is not optional for children. So it isn't just like, well, the child comes into the world with a set of reflexes and can adapt to any old environment. It's like, no, the environment has to be structured in a certain way or the child will die. And it's very interesting when it comes to things like play and touch, because you wouldn't think of those as fundamental necessities, right? But it turns out that they are. If you deprive a child badly enough of play and touch in the first 3 years of their life, even if they survive, what comes out at the end of that is often something that's like barely recognizable as a functional human being and cannot be repaired after that point. And that experiment was done with Romanian orphans back in the 90s. So it was an ugly situation, to say the least. Okay, so now you take these underlying biological systems and maybe they aggregate themselves into something that vaguely looks like your temperament, your 5 temperamental dimensions. So maybe if you're an extrovert, you're dominated by the dopaminergic system, just like you are if you're high in openness. And if you're high in neuroticism, it's mostly that you're dominated by anxiety systems and systems that mediate emotional pain. And if you're agreeable, you're dominated by the function of the underlying maternal/care affiliation systems. But so you could say, well, you've got these loose, you've got a multitude of fundamental biological predispositions that manifest themselves as implicit stories, something like that, and they organize themselves into the primary temperaments, and the primary temperaments are biasing factors that determine in part the nature of the interpretive structure that you're going to lay out in the world. It's not entirely determined by your temperament. We know that personality is only predicting, something like, let's say, 10% of the variance in most complex social outcomes. And the other elements are, well, temperamental as you might be, you still have to get along with other people and the world. So you come in with these internal biases, but they still have to be modified extensively by your social and your natural surround. Okay, and then you develop your routines from the bottom up, as Piaget pointed out, and sometimes from the top down, because now and then you can think yourself into a radical transformation. But mostly what you're doing is building the micro units of your interpretive schemas and your behaviors and aggregating them into higher order structures that you can then tag with higher order abstractions. And we talked about that. You can't tell a 3-year-old to clean up his room. And the reason for that is those are empty boxes as far as the kid's concerned. Clean? He might have room, he might have that. Clean he doesn't have. He might have pick up the teddy bear and put it in that space, right? So that's one of these little micro routines. And maybe you say, you put 20 of those micro routines together and now you can say, clean up your room. And basically what you're saying is, implement the 10 micro routines that you've learned. And so a well-functioning personality has all the micro routines in place. That's actually something that you help people with if you're a behavioral therapist, because one of the things you assume if you're a behavioral therapist is that sometimes the reason people aren't doing things is because they don't know how. Sometimes maybe the person's depressed but potentially high functioning. They got all the damn micro routines. They're well socialized. They're just dormant. You got to get them awake again and implementing them. But sometimes you get someone in your practice, say, who's just been neglected like you cannot believe, right? The parents never paid any attention to them, or maybe just punished them every time they did something good. That's really fun. And then, they didn't make friends, and so they're really, really vague and poorly articulated. And so then what you do is you work at the bottom of the micro routines and get them to practice building up all these little attributes that they didn't build up. And one of the things you can think about in terms of character development is, so now maybe you understand something about your own personality. You might say, well, what could you do to improve your personality? And the answer is, develop some of the micro routines on the other side of the personality distribution. So if you're disagreeable as hell, maybe you could start learning how to do nice things for people. And that actually works, by the way. So if you take disagreeable people who are depressed and you get them doing nice things for other people, their depression tends to lift. But then by the same token, if you're agreeable, then you should practice doing some things for yourself and being more tough-minded in your negotiations. And so you can sort of place yourself on the personality trait distribution. You're extroverted. It's like, okay, man, learn to spend some time with yourself, right? You're low in openness. Well, try reading a book that's outside of your sphere of interest now and then. If you're conscientious, well, you should probably learn how to relax occasionally, and so forth. So I think partly what you're doing as you're developing your personality is not moving the mean much, the average, where you're located, but you're extending the standard deviation so that you're a bigger bag of tricks than you were before. And I think you can practice that consciously. It's like you're hyper orderly. It's, well, get a dog, you know. Dogs are messy, horrible things, you know. It's just what you need if you're hyper orderly, because they're going to leave hair everywhere and force you to live with it. And I would say you don't just have to face the reality of unjust suffering and death in your life. You have to face the reality of hell. And you might say, well, I don't believe in hell. It's like, well, do you believe in Nazi Germany? You know, do you believe in the Stalinist Soviet Union or Maoist China or Cambodia? That's hell. And you can assess that more deeply. You could say, well, that's not even hell. That's not as precise a formulation of hell as you might be able to conceptualize. Hell is actually participation in the process that led to the establishment of those countries. And that's something that human beings do. And the fact that we do that is something we have to face. And maybe that's even worse than death. And I think you can make a case for that. I really do. I think there are things in life that are worse than death. There are things in life that are worse than unjust suffering and death. And the things that lead to hell are worse. And you might think, well, I don't have to worry about that. It's like, yeah, you do, as a matter of fact, because you're going to face those things too. And you're going to face that when you face your own malevolence, which you will, and you're going to face that when you face the malevolence of others, including the mob. And some of that's just death and tragedy, and some of it is something far darker and deeper than that. And so, yeah, you face that. And so that's kind of interesting. And then you might think, well, how should you face that? And that's where Tammy's story is relevant. It's like, well, so she went and swam with the sharks. And I wasn't very happy about that, because our life has been adventurous enough. I thought, do you really need to go swim with the sharks? And the answer seemed to be, well, that would be an adventure. And, you know, I don't interfere with her when she's having an adventure. She's going to go have an adventure. It's far be it for me to interfere. And then she told me, you know, that you had to look the shark in the eye or it would think you're prey. Think, well, what do you have to look in the eye so you're not prey? And, you know, human beings have been trying to figure that out for a long time, because we're strange animals, because we're predators, but we're also prey. And so I guess at any moment you're sort of deciding, well, are you a predator? Are you the thing that's on top, or are you prey? And you're prey if you turn tail and run. And there's a psychological truth there, like a deep psychological truth. And it seems to be something like, if you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because
You're alive, here you are, you got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second, how would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure? You know, regardless of its scope, and the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life. In whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise in its deepest sense is that process of preparation. And you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. And that's a pretty noble goal, you know, because it's realistic. It's not naive at all. It says, look, man, you know, trouble's coming your way, and it's real. And yet it's possible that you could confront that and still do good in the deepest sense. It's like, well, that's quite something. It would be really quite something if that's true. And one of the preconditions of that would be faith, I suppose. And in some sense, that's what Tammy was manifesting when she went down and swam with the sharks. Faith that if she looked the bloody predator in the eye, that would solve the problem. And then you think too, well, could it be any other way? It's like, well, we have all these problems in our lives, and we could think there's two possible ways of approaching those problems. One would be we just ignore them in the hopes they would what? Go away? Well, and no one thinks that's, no one who isn't a child thinks that, and very few children. Nobody believes that. We know perfectly well that if you got to face something, man, you better face it. And if you're going to face it, that's probably the best pathway forward. And then you might think, well, what does that mean ultimately? And it might mean something like, face it, you know, as deeply as you possibly can and as voluntarily as you possibly can. And there's an element of faith in that because you have to put yourself on the line. But you're kind of stuck with that anyways. You know, that's the rub.
That's Nietzsche's realization. He said, look, imagine that you live within a belief system, and then something arises to challenge the belief system. Not only does the belief system collapse, but something worse happens. Your belief in belief systems collapses. And that's the road to not. Now, it doesn't have to, because you can jump from one belief system to another. But sometimes that doesn't work, is that you do a meta-critique and you say, oh, I was living in this protective structure, and it turned out to be flawed. Okay, one alternative is jump to another protective structure. Fine. Another alternative is protective structures themselves are not to be trusted. Bang, you're in chaos. How the hell are you going to get out of that? That's the pathway to nihilism. Well, you can work your way through that. That's difficult. Or you can do what Jung would regard as a soul-damaging move, and you can sacrifice your new knowledge and re-identify with something rigid and restricted, which is what I would say is happening to some degree with the people in Europe who are turning to a regressive nationalism as an alternative to the current state of chaos. It's like, I know that people need to identify with local groups. I understand that. But they risk the danger of making the state the ultimate God. And that's order, but that's not a good replacement for chaos. It's just another kind of catastrophe, right? Too much order, too much chaos, both catastrophes. You want to stand in the middle somehow and mediate between the two, and that's where you have your real strength. Because then it isn't that you've discovered a safe place Because even the bloody right-wingers are after a safe place, right? They just want it to be the state. Yeah, exactly. Well, there's no safe places. And the next issue is, do you really want a safe place? Is that what you want? You want to be so weak that you want to be protected from threat? What the hell kind of life is that? You're a paralyzed rabbit in a hole. That's no life for a human being. You should be confronting danger and the unknown and malevolence, because, and the reason for that too is, this is the weird paradox. This is, and I believe this is the paradox, first of all, that was discovered in part by Buddha, but also laid forth very clearly in Christianity, which is that the solution to the problem of tragedy and malevolence is the willingness to face them. Now, who the hell would ever guess that? It's completely paradoxical. It's a completely paradoxical suggestion. Is that, well, why does it work? Well, because the more you confront the two of them, the more you grow. And maybe you can grow so that you're actually larger than the chaos and malevolence itself. And you think, well, what's the evidence for that? And that's easy. That's what people do. That is how we learn. Like every time you expose your child to something new, a playground, what are they exposed to? Chaos and malevolence. Now, there's more to it than that, obviously, because kids play and they promote each other and they form friendships and all of that. But in the playground itself, there is the complexity of the social structure and the malevolence of the bully. It's right there. And you throw your kid in there and you say, adapt, and they do. Okay, so they can do it at a small scale. It's not trivial. The playground's a complicated place. The kid can adapt. Well, how much can you scale that up? Can you scale that up to, from the chaos and order and malevolence of the playground to chaos and order and malevolence itself? Well, that's the question. Well, I don't think there's any reason to answer that in the negative. So, because we don't know the full extent of a human being. And it is the problem that's worked out. So in the Buddha story, for example, what happens after, so Buddha's world collapses in the same way that Adam and Eve's world collapses. It's a consequence of repetitive exposure to mortality and death. What happens to Buddha is he realizes that the little protected city that his father made for him, the walled garden, it's exactly the same motif that's in this Adam and Eve story, it's fatally flawed. That kind of protection cannot exist, and he discovers that in pieces, right? Which is exactly what happens to children, is that they go out, they discover a limit, they run back. And the parents can help them with the limit. They run out, they discover a limit, they run back. But at some point they run out, they discover a limit, they run back, and the parents have nothing to say to them. Because they've hit the same limit that the parents hit. Which is like, well, what are you going to do with your life? How are you going to operate in this archetypal universe? Well, your parents can only say, well, they can say you identify with the proper archetypal figures. They do that, they at least act that out for you, but at some point it's a problem that they cannot solve for you without making you weaker. That's the thing, So it's an interesting thing that I've learned in therapy, because one of the things you have to learn as a therapist is, how do you not take your client's problems home with you? It's a very common existential problem that beginning therapists face, because they're afraid. It's like, well, you're dealing with people all the time who have serious problems. Sometimes it's mental illness, although less frequently than you'd think. And sometimes it's just that they're having a good catastrophe, right? Their parents have cancer or something like that, or their father has Alzheimer's and they're unemployed, or they have a drug problem, or they have a schizophrenic son, or like, these aren't mental illness problems, right? Those are just catastrophes. And so people are discussing those with you all the time. How do you avoid being crushed by that or avoid taking it home? And the answer to that is, you don't steal the problem. That's the answer. It's like, you have some problems. If you come and talk to me, I'll help you figure out how to solve them. I will not tell you how to solve them. I won't steal your problems. Because what we're trying to do in therapy is, number one, solve your problem. Number two, turn you into a great solver of problems. And the second one is way more important than the first one. And so you never solve someone's problem by removing from them the opportunity to solve their problem. That's theft. That's the Oedipal situation. That's the Oedipal situation. That's the overprotective mother. Now, father can play that role too. We're talking about archetypal representations. It's like, I'll protect you at the cost of your ability to protect yourself. No. Wrong. That's a sin. That's a good way of thinking about it. That is not what you do with people. Not with your children, not with your partner, not with yourself. You don't do that. That destroys people's adaptive competence. And it disarms them in the face of chaos and malevolence. And that's a terrible thing. You're going to send someone out unarmed in a world like that? It's a terrible thing to do. So, and if people aren't strong enough to manage it, then they get resentful. And then, you know, you get the downhill spiral that goes along with that. Okay, so the meta story is partly you're in a you have a map, but it's insufficient and things will come up to disrupt it, and sometimes the disruption is catastrophic. Everything falls apart. That's what happens to the Buddha, and that's what happens to Adam and Eve. And the rest of the biblical stories are actually an attempt to put that back together. Now, that's been assembled, as I said, it's been assembled over centuries, right? Okay, we've got the problem. The problem is the apocalypse, the ever-present reality of the apocalyptic fall. That's the problem. And so you could say, well, what is that? It's the insufficiency of all potential conceptual schemes. Right. Your conceptual schemes are insufficient to deal with the complexity of the world. It's a permanent problem. So what do? You stop relying on your conceptual schemes. That's part of the answer. You start relying on instead on your ability to actively generate conceptual schemes in the face of chaos and malevolence. And so that makes you someone that identifies with your creative capacity, your creative, courageous capacity for articulation and action in the face of the unknown, rather than some formulaic approach to the territory. And the idea is that elevates your character to the point where you can withstand tragedy and malevolence without becoming corrupt. And that provides a permanent solution to the problem. Well, then you might say, cynically, what's your evidence that that's a permanent solution? And the answer to that is, well, the evidence isn't all in yet. First of all, because people only live that way partially. And so we haven't put the hypothesis to the full test. And second, we don't know what our limitations are. We have no idea what our limitations are. And they're both greater and lesser than we imagine. Because you have to ask yourself, like, if people stopped adding voluntarily to the misery of the world and devoted themselves to setting things straight, setting themselves straight and setting the things around them straight, what would happen? And the answer to that is, well, there'd be a hell of a lot less unnecessary misery in the world. So that might not be a bad place to start. But apart from that, there's very little that we can say. Could we overcome the catastrophe of mortality? Why not? You think that's beyond our capacity? Could we make the world a place where no one was suffering any more than necessary and still allow the world to exist? Well, possibly, because we don't know the limitations of our capacity. We're only running at 40%, if that, I would say. We don't make full use of all the people that are in the world. We don't have our situation set up so that the gifts that they could offer to everyone are fully realized. We haven't set the systems up for that yet, so we waste people like mad, and then we waste ourselves like mad. And so I would say this is something also that's one of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament Jews. This is, I think, one of the reasons that their book has become so central, is because what happens in the Old Testament after the fall is that Israel produces a series of states, right? Rise of state and then a fall, and then a rise of another state and then a fall. So it's the same thing, except it's happening at a political level. The political state rises, it gets corrupt, it falls. It rises out of the ashes again, gets corrupt, and falls. I think that happens 6 times in the Old Testament. And one of the things that's very interesting is the reaction of the Jews. They always say, it was our fault. Instead of taking the Cain and Abel route, and I'm going to tell you the Cain and Abel story right away. Instead of taking the Cain and Abel route, they always say, if the state collapsed, it was because we did something wrong. That's very different than saying, you know, it's arbitrary fate. It's the nature of arbitrary fate, or the structure of reality, that we're doomed to collapse into chaos, and that's an indication of the corruption of being. Well, you can take that route if you want. It's the corruption of being. Well, good luck with that. So what are you going to do about that? That's easy. You'll start to work for the destruction of being. That's what you will do. The alternative is to say, this terrible thing happened and somehow it's my fault. Well, at least that opens you up the pathway to doing something about it, and maybe it's actually the case. Maybe terrible things happen because you're just not who you should be. At least you know that's true to some degree, right? You know it. because things happen to you all the time and you think, well, you know, if I just would have played that game straight, and if I would have put this thing in order, that wouldn't have happened. It's like, okay, fine. What's the ultimate extent of that? Dostoevsky said at one point that every human being was not only responsible for everything that happened to him or her, but also simultaneously responsible for everything that happened to everyone else. Now I would say it's almost a hallucinogenic idea, right? It's a transcendent idea, and it can go very wrong. Sometimes depressed people, for example, get hyper responsible for what's happened, and it just crushes them. And so it's a mode of thinking that can produce its attendant pathologies. But there's something about it that's metaphysically true.
And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did. And then you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good,
Yeah.
you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? Yeah. There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good.
Well, it's a revelation, a good idea. Yeah. It's a gift. It's grace.
Where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very curious.
That's exactly right.
Because
I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right? Yeah. We know what chemicals and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, they know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to, 60 or 70, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim, and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that, because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children. Okay, you wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it. But it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away, no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift and God only knows what it's worth. You know, you could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life. And you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it. And that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. Mm-hmm. And people do that to themselves all the time. Yep. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, you know. This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand, all of a sudden there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, you know, they just wrote this first, you know, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about these that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, it'll come and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come.
Yeah.
We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book.
Yeah.
And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems and his uncle who's a Navy SEAL can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And he can
that fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path and the story will come or the idea will come. And
Well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. And some days I was highly productive and other days I wasn't so productive. But every day, if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. And then I got better at being productive and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours. I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day and do it every day and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article, a good newspaper article, pretty much in one draft. But that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up so that, you know, everything I wrote was just painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails, and then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is.
Well, this is a strange one. I don't know about you people from Sydney. So it's from Kathy Newman, which strikes me as somewhat unlikely. And it's got 164 upvotes, which is quite a few upvotes. It hurt when you destroyed me on ABC. Now, I don't know if that's referring to last night or so many months ago, but I've enrolled in university to get my facts right. Yeah, well, that probably won't work. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. Yeah, well, it's not exactly a question. It's 4 sentences that are quite the strange combination. I would say something about the burns are still healing. You know, I mean, Nietzsche said that you could tell much about a man's character by how much truth he could tolerate, which is very interesting. You know, there's an idea in the great Western tradition that the truth is the way and the path of life, and that no one comes to the Father except through the truth. And I believe that to be the case, because I don't think that you can manifest who you are without the truth. And so I think it's literally and metaphorically truth, that the pathway to who you could be if you were completely who you were is through the truth. And I would say, and so the truth does set you free, but the problem is that it destroys everything that isn't worthy in you as it sets you free, and that's that's a process of burning. And it's painful because you cling to what you shouldn't be, partly out of pride and partly out of ignorance and partly out of laziness. And so then you encounter something true, and you all know this perfectly well, because when was the last time that you learned something important that wasn't a blow of some sort, you know? And it's often you look back at your life and you think, oh God, I really learned something there. I wouldn't want to do that again, but it really changed my life. I mean, sometimes it can really destroy you, you know, an encounter with the truth, and you never really recover. But now and then something comes along and straightens you out, and a lot of you has to go. A lot of you has to burn away, you know, and I suppose in some sense the idea is that everything about you that isn't worthy is to be put into the flames. And that's another reason to be not so casual about claiming what you believe, because it isn't something that you undertake without due caution. You know, I learned when I was a kid, about 25 or so, a little older than a kid, that almost everything that I said was one form of lie or another. And I wasn't any worse, I would say, than the people that I was associating with, or any better. And the lies were manifold, you know. They were attempts to win arguments for the sake of winning the argument. That might be one. Attempts to indicate my intellectual prowess when there were competitions of that sort. Maybe just the sheer pleasure of engaging in an intellectual argument and winning. My inability to distinguish between ideas that I had read and incorporated because I had read but hadn't realized that I hadn't yet earned the right to use, all of that. And, you know, I had this experience that lasted a long time. Well, I would say it's really never gone away. And I think this was the awakening of my conscience, essentially. And I didn't realize this until much later, when I was reading Socrates' Apology. This voice, for lack of a better word, made itself manifest inside me, and it said every time I said something that wasn't true, and that's usually what it said. That's not true. You don't believe that. Or there was a sensation that was associated with it. I don't think this is that uncommon, you know. I asked my psychology classes for many years in a row if they had an experience, that they had a voice in their head, let's say, it's a metaphor, or a feeling that communicated to them when they were about to do something wrong. And it was universally the case that people agreed with one of those statements or another. And the other thing I would ask is, well, do you always listen to it? And of course the answer to that was definitely no. But that's also very interesting, you know, that you can have this faculty, this conscience. This seems to me to be very tightly associated with the idea of free will, is that you can have this internal voice, this daemon, the root word for democracy. Oh yes, I didn't finish that story. So yes, well, it's important. Well, so Socrates' daemon told him it was his moral guide. And democracy appears to be predicated on the idea that the polity will function if people attend to their consciences. That's the overlap of those conceptualizations. And well, first of all, I think that's the case, you know, and it makes a certain amount of logical sense. I mean, if we assume that the political state is something like the emergent consequence of the decisions of all its citizens, we would assume that the wiser the decisions of the citizens, the more upright and functional the state. I can't see how it could be any other way. And perhaps those who are the most upright, who listen to their consciences more carefully, even play a disproportionately powerful role. It's certainly possible. So, anyways, back to truth. Well, you know, I learned that so much of what I was doing was false. And I think I learned this. See, there was a reason that this came to me so clearly. I was trying to understand why people did terrible things. And I was really concentrating on the terrible, terrible things that people do. And I was interested in Auschwitz, for example, and not as a political phenomenon, but as a psychological phenomenon. I was curious about how you could be an Auschwitz guard. And I wasn't really curious about how you could be one, because, well, you could be one, that, of course. I was more curious about how I could be one, being such a good person as I thought I was. But I also knew that many people did many terrible things during the 20th century, and the idea that I was somehow better than them, or that I should assume a priori that I was better than them, and that I wouldn't have made the same choices or worse had I been in the same situation, was a very, very, very dangerous supposition. And in fact, a sufficiently dangerous supposition to bring about the very danger that I assumed was worth avoiding. I had this idea, that what had happened, especially in Nazi Germany, but also in the Soviet Union, shouldn't happen again. That what we needed to do, because of what happened in the 20th century, especially because we also managed to create hydrogen bombs, that we had become so technologically powerful that there wasn't time for that anymore, that time for that was over, and that we really needed to understand why it happened, and that perhaps we could go deep enough in that understanding, which is, I think, what happens when you go deep into understanding, so that you could stop it. Because if you understand a problem, maybe you can solve it, and at least in part, I came to believe that the problem was, as Solzhenitsyn said, that the problem is that the line between good and evil runs down every human heart. And I was reading Jung at the same time, and he believed that the human soul was a tree whose roots grew all the way to hell, and believed also that in the full investigation of the shadow, which was the dark side of the human psyche, was that it was bottomless, essentially, that it was like an experience of hell. And that also struck me as true. And that the way to stop those sorts of things from happening was to stop yourself from being the sort of person who would do it, who would even start to do it. Because the other thing you learn when you learn about atrocities of that sort, you could read Ordinary Men, by the way, which is an unbelievably great study of exactly this sort of phenomenon. It's on my book list on my website. It's about a group of German policemen who were turned into brutal murderers over a period of months when they went into Poland after the Germans had marched through. And they were just ordinary middle-class men. And they weren't forced into this by their leadership, by the way, either, which is one of the things that makes the book so interesting. So for me, it was a matter of understanding that if we want this sort of thing to not happen anymore, then we have to start to become the sort of people who wouldn't do it, which seems rather self-evident, all things considered, unless you believe that we're the pawns of social forces, for example, like the Marxists do. And I don't believe that, because we're also the creator of social forces. And we're also capable of standing up to social forces, because I would say the individual is more powerful than the social force, all things considered, interestingly enough, that the way to stop such things from happening, the way to remember properly, is to understand that you could do it, that you could do those terrible things, because the people who did them were like you, and that the way out of that is to stop being like that. And the way you stop being like that is, well, at least in part, by ceasing to tell yourself lies that you don't believe in, and that you shouldn't act out. And and that's made a huge difference in my life, for better or for worse. I mean, it was a very uncanny experience, I would say, because it's very discombobulating to experience yourself as fragmented enough so that much of what you do and say is actually false. It's a lot of work to clean that up, a lot. But the consequences are, in principle, worthwhile. And so that was part of what, understanding that was part of what drove me towards clinical psychology, say, and away from political science and law and from politics in general, because I started to believe that, and I think this is the great Western idea, which people were quite irritated about, by the way, on Q&A last night as well, that the proper route forward for the redemption of the individual and for mankind as a whole is as a consequence of the redemption of each individual. And I truly believe that. And I believe that that occurs as a consequence of adherence to the truth and courage in the face of being. That's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back, is to take on the onslaught and to enter the contentious ring and to do more than your best, because your best isn't enough, because your best isn't as good as you could be. You have to push yourself past that. And that's, as far as I can tell, where you find what you need in life. You find the meaning that sustains you in life, and you find the patterns of action that redeem the world, both at the same time. I mean, life is a very difficult business. You know, it's fatal, and it's full of suffering, and it's full of betrayal and malevolence. There's nothing about it that's trivial. It's all profound. And in order to find your way through all of that capacity for hellish experience, let's say, you need to develop a relationship with something that's profound. And you can. You have that capacity. And what could be more profound than the truth? And what would you rather have on your side? And you might say, well, that's obvious, and of course everyone should do that. And then you need to know why you don't. And the answer is, well, sort of encapsulated in this first amusing question, you know. Thank you for enlightening my soul. The burns are still healing. It's like, well, you know, there's no shortage of dead wood to burn off. And there's no shortage of pain when the dead wood burns off. And that's what makes people afraid of the truth. You know, maybe that's why Moses encountered God in a burning bush. Who the hell knows? But there's something about that idea that seems to me to be the case. And so, what's the decision that you make? You know, you decide to believe. You know, it's a risk, an existential risk. It's an act of faith. You believe that the truth can set you free. You believe that people have an intrinsic divinity about their soul. You decide that you're going to live in that manner and that you're going to let everything about yourself that isn't worthy of that goal die. And that might be almost everything that you are. And that's a terrible thing to contemplate. The only thing that's worse, I would say, is the alternative, because the alternative is the sorts of hells that we managed to produce around us and that we produced with particular expertise during the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century. And it would be a good thing if we decided collectively and individually not to go back there again.
If you're suffering, you are obligated, in a sense, to hold on to whatever rope someone throws you. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. That's when life is worthwhile. I don't know exactly what's going to help you, but don't arbitrarily throw out any possibilities because you might not have that luxury. Antidepressants help a lot of people, and there are technical reasons why that's the case. If you're offered a gift by your society and it works, try it. I don't care what your presuppositions are. The time you see people who are suffering with depression, for example. There's a multitude of reasons, but I'll take one common reason. You could think about it as associated with the story of Peter Pan. Peter Pan is someone who won't grow up, right? Now the problem with Peter Pan is he gets to be king, but it's king of Neverland. Neverland doesn't exist. So being king of nothing isn't that helpful. Well, one of the things that you often see with people who suffer from depression, and I'm not making a blanket statement about the cause of depression because there's lots of them, is that people who don't have enough order in their life tend to get overwhelmed. So for example, if someone comes into me to see me and they say they're depressed, I always ask them a very standard set of questions. Do you have a job? If you don't have a job, you're really in trouble in our society. First of all, your biological rhythms tend to go off the rails right away because there's no reason to go to bed at any particular time and there's no reason to get up. And for many people, if they don't get up at the same time, they foul up the functioning of their circadian rhythms, and that's enough to make them depressed right off the bat, especially if they start napping during the afternoon. They also don't have a purpose. People aren't good without a purpose, and this isn't hypothesizing. We absolutely understand the circuitry that underlies positive emotion. When you're attending to something you're interested in and you're engaged in it, that's when you're alive. That's when life is worthwhile. It's so worthwhile that in those moments you don't even ask the question about it. The question itself goes away because the meaning that you're united with is so powerful that it can push back the adversity that would otherwise characterize life. Nietzsche said, the person who has a why can bear any how. We know how it works. Almost all the positive emotion that any of you are likely to experience in your life will not be a consequence of attaining things. It will be a consequence of seeing that things are working as you proceed towards a goal you value. That's completely different. And you need to know this because people are often stunned, for example. They finish their PhD thesis and their presupposition is that they're going to be elated for a month. And often instead they're actually depressed. And they think, oh, what the hell, I've been working on this for 7 years and I handed it in and what do I do now? And that's what depresses them, right? It's the what do I do now? Well, they're fine if they enjoyed it, pursuing the thing. As long as it was working out, they get a lot of enthusiasm and excitement out of that because that's how our nervous systems work. Most of your positive emotion is goal pursuit emotion. If you take drugs like cocaine or amphetamine, the reason they're enjoyable is because they turn on the systems that help you pursue goals. That's why people like them. So if you don't have a job, you got no structure, that's not good. Plus, you tend not to have a point. So you're overwhelmed by chaotic lack of structure and you don't have any positive emotion. I don't have any aims, and then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens, because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend, you have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell. So why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?
So one of the pathways that's on display with regards to the formulation of an identity, let's say, is this injunction, which is really a temptation to love yourself. So we should take that apart. Now, the first question might be, well, what do you mean by yourself? And one answer to that is the person I am now. And you should love and feel good about the person you are now. And that's actually a dubious proposition for a variety of reasons. One is, whatever yourself is not only what you are. Yourself is also what you could become, and what you will and could become. And so to love yourself properly is not only to love what you are, who you are, whatever that means, but to love who you could become. Now, one of the things I've observed is that it's very demoralizing, let's say, for the typical young man. It's true for the typical young woman as well. So we'll say the typical young person who's miserable and maladjusted psychologically and socially, if you just go to them and say, well, you should feel good about yourself, because they think you're good just the way you are. You're perfect just the way you are. You should accept yourself just the way you are. It's like, well, okay, so what does that say about who I should become? Is that just now off the table because I'm already good enough in every way? So am I done or something? What about who I should become? And then, well, how should I feel good about myself when I don't? Because I'm not getting along with myself. I'm anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and depressed, and I'm not getting along with other people. So how is it that that's all somehow something I should feel good about without being deluded? And these are complicated questions, because you don't want to beat yourself with a stick, which might be the opposite of that. So, well, feel bad about yourself. It's like, no, be judicious and merciful with yourself, and think that you need to accept yourself in some way, the way a mother accepts a child. But the maternal spirit is not the only spirit that governs the love that a child requires properly. You have the paternal spirit of encouragement as well, which is, well, we need to shelter and protect you and to provide for your security the way you are, but you could be a lot better and should be, and I have faith that you could be, which is the love that I'm delivering to what you're becoming rather than what you are. And so love that you direct towards yourself is partly directed towards that maternal care that's sort of the minimum precondition for basic flourishing, combined with an attitude of encouragement towards the possibilities of your being. And so that's a much more sophisticated so-called self-love, partly because it's the kind of love that envisions you as something that unfolds across time. And it's a much richer conception, because it also implies that there's a responsible adventure to your life. Like you're not all you could be, and there's pain in that, and there's the necessity for a certain amount of judgment about that, and even a certain amount of exclusion, because what you are that is insufficient in some sense should not be allowed to propagate further. But if it's conjoined with encouragement, it's like, yeah, you're in a rough situation there, kiddo, but here's some things about you that are virtuous and good, and they're pretty powerful, actually. And if you just made those more manifest, you could dispense with a lot of this immaturity and misery, and you could expand yourself out into life physically and psychologically, and you could start walking this pathway that makes things better. And the thing is that as soon as you start walking the pathway that makes things better, then things immediately become better, because your whole orientation changes. And if you're in a bad place but you're escaping, that's pretty positive, even if it's a bad place. And you might think, well, it's still bad, but it's better. It's like, well, that's a lot better than a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure, because that's hell. Hell is a bad place that's getting worse. That's for sure. And so if you take the bad place and it's getting better, well, it's already not hell. That's a start. And so this notion of love, we've confused this with the maternal instinct for an infant. It's like, because an infant under 6 months, it's like, well, of course, your attitude towards an infant is you're exactly okay the way you are, in the sense that there's nothing to do with an infant under 6 months in the most fundamental sense, except to provide them with total care. But that's not what you do to any child that's older than 6 months. You start laying down some criteria for becoming, for improvement. And some of that improvement, because we can define it, well, there's nothing more perfect than a child, than a baby. It's like, yeah, but that's not true if the baby's 14 years old, right? It's true if the baby's 6 months old and actually a baby. But by 9 months, well, the child is going to start to interact socially. And now there's some principles that the child has to learn to abide by so that social interaction is optimized. And then you want to replace the infant with the toddler who has a certain domain of autonomy and responsibility and a certain capacity for social interaction, and you want to replace the toddler with the young child, with the preschooler, who now can negotiate a shared social space, and you want to replace the preschooler with the older child who's now capable of taking on as much domestic responsibility as is appropriate for that age. You want to take the infant who's entirely dependent and turn them into something that's autonomous and then socially integrated in a manner that's moving them towards individual responsibility. And the love is not only love that's devoted to what they are at any point, which is that encompassing maternal love, say, but the love that says, yeah, kid, you know, we're pretty happy you're around, but the new you is going to even be better. And that's encouragement, and that's part of love. It's half of love, that's for sure. And you want to direct that to yourself as well. It's like, you don't want to judge who you are so harshly that you just destroy yourself and everything is cast into the pit. You want to take a look at yourself and say, look, you know, you're a person among persons, and you have intrinsic worth, and you have your flaws, your sins, your domain of ignorance and inadequacy, but that doesn't mean that you're entirely worthless because of that. You have a base level value. That's intrinsic worth, let's say, that's reflective of the fact that you're made in the divine image in the most fundamental sense. You have intrinsic worth, and that's due a certain degree of baseline love. But there's the becoming problem. It's like, well, especially when you're young, most of you is still in the becoming phase. And so why wouldn't encouragement be the hallmark of love? It's like, get the hell up, get your act together, adopt some responsibility, put your life together, develop a vision, expand yourself beyond the narrow confines that are causing your misery. And we think you can do it. You could do it, you should do it, the world would be better off if you did it, you'd be doing better if you did it, everything would work out better. Why would we not work to make everything work out better? And you're the person who could do it. And you tell young people that, and they think, well, no one ever told me that before in that way. And they think, well, maybe I should get my act together. And then they go out and try to get their act together in some micro ways, and they think, well, turned out that worked, and I'm less miserable. I could try doing it a little bit on a broader scale. And they try that, and they think, wow, people seem a lot happier with me. I have more friends, and I'm more popular, and I'm a little more physically attractive because I'm standing up a little bit straighter. And then away they go. And why would you, unless you believe that human being is corrupt and pathological in its essence, which many people now seem to believe, or at least some dread spirit seems to insist, and people agree with it. If you don't buy that, then you think, well, yeah, you unfold, man. Unfold all those manifold possibilities that lurk within, and be a force for good in the world, and that'll be the adventure of your life. And I guess we could also add to that a bit of a disquisition on truth. So you should be oriented by love, and you could say, well, that's the desire to care for being and becoming, however it's manifest, to want that to turn out in the best possible manner. That could be your goal. I want things to turn out in the best possible manner. And you have to decide if that's true, because people are tempted to create little hells around them all the time. So don't be thinking that necessarily you want that, because it's not that easy to orient yourself so that that's all you want, because you're bitter and resentful and angry. And so all of that's going to interfere with that vision of love. And then you might say, well, Now that you have that vision, what do you have as weapons to clear your path, let's say, or to set things in order as you move forward? And one of the answers to that is we have truth. Well, why? Well, because you want to contend with the world the way it is, obviously. So truth is going to be useful in that endeavor. And then you might say, well, if I could get away with something by not telling the truth, why shouldn't I just lie? If I could get what I wanted and if I could avoid responsibility, why not lie? And the first answer is, well, what makes you so sure you want to avoid responsibility except narrowly in this moment, because it's not a good medium to long-term strategy and everyone knows it. And what makes you think that manipulating people in the short term so that you can gratify a whim is going to be a useful iterative strategy? It's like it's not. So you can dispense with that. And so what do you do when you tell the truth? Instead, is you predicate your actions on an axiom of faith, which is that nothing better can happen than that which happens if you live in truth. And that's a statement of deep religious faith, because the evidence for that can only be gathered as a consequence of manifesting the actions that are predicated upon that axiom of faith. You don't know till you lay it out. But you can say, well, I believe that the truth will set me free. And then you think, well, the truth will set me free. Who's me? Back to identity. Well, if you're lying, it's not you by definition, because if you're lying, you're attempting to implement a falsehood. You're attempting to falsify the world and yourself. That's what a lie is. And so if something happens that's good because you lied, it's not happening to you. It's a reward for the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you. And if you reward the spirit of deceit that you allowed to inhabit you, it will grow. And I would not recommend that. That's a very bad idea. In the contrary situation, you live and speak in truth, and then things happen. They're happening to you. That's your life, man. That's your adventure. And one of the things that's very interesting about the truth in that regard is that it provides a certain optimal unpredictability. You know, if you're talking to somebody, you think, maybe you're being interviewed, or maybe you're having a discussion with someone, you think, I'd like to impress this person. It's like, now you have a little vision of what the instrumental outcome of the conversation could be so that it reflects positively on some narrow conception of a desired future state. I want this person to be impressed with me. So I'm only going to say things they want to hear and that sound impressive. That's all lies. It's like, well, maybe you'll get that result, but it won't be what you want because it's predicated on a falsehood. Instead, you could just have a conversation with the person, like a real conversation. It's like, what do you think? Here's what I think. Do you like it or not like it? It's like, well, I don't know if you like it or not like it. It's like, we can talk about that and why, but it's still what I think. And that doesn't mean it's right, but it's what I think. Well, then you lay that out, and then what happens to you is what happens to you. And then it's unpredictable, because imagine you're speaking deceitfully and instrumentally. You want something from someone. Okay, well then you're lying, so the you that receives is not you. It's the spirit of deceit. And it's also, you're instrumental because you think that that narrow vision is optimal, even though it requires deceit. You can just throw that away and you can say, well, I'm going to say what I think, carefully and judiciously, feeling out the words, and then I'm going to accept whatever happens, no matter how unpredictable. And then what you'll find is that's where you have adventure. Because you might ask too, well, what do you have to offset against the catastrophe of life? Responsibility, friendship, place, job, career, education, all of that. Adventure. Adventure. Is the adventure worth it? Well, if you tell the truth, you will have the adventure of your life. That's what will happen.
That's that willingness to gaze into the abyss, which is obviously what you were doing when you went to Ukraine. It's like, it's gazing into the abyss that makes you better. The thing is, and this is maybe where Nietzsche's idea is not as differentiated as it became. Sometimes your gaze can be forcefully directed towards the abyss, and then you're traumatized. If it's involuntary and accidental, it can kill you. The more it's voluntary, the more transformative it is. And that's part of that idea about facing death and hell.
It's like, can you tolerate death and hell? And the answer is, this terrible answer is, yes, to the degree that you're willing to do it voluntarily. And then you might ask, well, why should I have to subject myself to death and hell? I'm innocent. And then the answer to that is, even the innocent must be voluntarily sacrificed to the highest.
That's such an interesting distinction. Voluntary suffering.
Voluntary, yeah. Yeah. Well, that's why the central Christian doctrine is pick up your cross and follow me. And I'm speaking not in religious terms saying that. I'm just speaking as a psychologist. It's like one of the things we've learned in the last 100 years is voluntary exposure to that which freezes and terrifies you in measured proportions is curative. The first thing I do as a clinician, if someone comes to me and says they're depressed, is ask myself a question. Well, what does this person mean by that? So I have to find out, like, because maybe they're not depressed, maybe they're hyper anxious, or maybe they're obsessional. Like there's various forms of powerful negative emotion. So they need to be differentiated. But then the next question you have to ask is, well, are you depressed or do you have a terrible life? Or is it some combination of the two? So if you're depressed, as far as I can tell, you don't have a terrible life. You have friends, you have family, you have an intimate relationship, you have a job or a career. You're about as educated as you should be given your intelligence. Use your time outside of work wisely. You're not beholden to alcohol or other temptations. You're engaged in the community in some fundamental sense, and all that's working. Now, if you have all that and you're feeling really awful, you're either ill or you're depressed. And so then sometimes there's a biochemical route to that, treatment of that. My experience has been as a clinician is if you're depressed, but you have a life and you take an antidepressant, it will probably help you a lot. Now, maybe you're not depressed. Exactly. You just have a terrible life. What does that look like? You have no relationship. Your family's a mess. You've got no friends. You've got no plan. You've got no job. You use your time outside of work, not only badly, but destructively. You have a drug or alcohol habit or some other vice, pornography addiction. You're completely unengaged in the surrounding community. You have no scaffolding whatsoever to support you in your current mode of being or you move forward. And then as a therapist, well, you do two things. Well, if it's depression per se, well, like I said, there's sometimes a biochemical route, a nutritional route. There's ways that can be addressed. It's probably physiological if you're, at least in part, if you're depressed but you have an okay life. Sometimes it's conceptual. You can turn to dreams, sometimes to help people, because dreams contain the seeds of the potential future. And if your person is a real good dreamer and you can analyze dreams, that can be really helpful. But that seems to be only true for more creative people. And for the people who just have a terrible life, it's like, okay, you have a terrible life. Well, let's pick a front. How about you need a friend, like one sort of friend? Do you know how to shake hands and introduce yourself? I'll have the person show me. So let's do it for a sec. So, yes, hi, I'm Jordan. And people don't know how to do that. And then they can't even get the ball rolling.
For the listener, Jordan just gave me a firm handshake.
Yeah, as opposed to a dead fish. You know, and there's these elementary social skills that hypothetically, if you were well cared for, you learned when you were like 3. And sometimes I had lots of clients to whom no one ever paid any attention. And they needed like 10,000 hours of attention. And some of that was just listening because they had 10,000 hours of conversations they never had with anyone. And they were all tangled up in their head. And they had to just, one client in particular, I worked with this person for 15 years. And what she wanted from me was for me just to shut the hell up for 50 minutes, which was very hard for me. And to just tell me what had happened to her. And then what happened at the end of the conversation, then I could discuss a bit with her. And then as we progressed through the years, the amount of time that we spent in discussion increased in proportion in the sessions until by the time we stopped seeing each other, when my clinical practice collapsed, we were talking about 80% of the time. But she'd never been attended to properly, ever. And so she was an uncarved block in the Taoist sense, right? She hadn't been subjected to those flaming swords that separated the wheat from the chaff. And so you can do that in therapy. If you're listening and you're depressed, I would say if you can't find a therapist, and that's getting harder and harder because it's actually become illegal to be a therapist now because you have to agree with your clients, which is a terrible thing to do with them. Just like it's terrible just to arbitrarily oppose them. You could do the self-authoring program online because it helps you write an autobiography. And so if you have memories that are more than 18 months old that bother you when you think them up, part of you is locked inside that. An undeveloped part of you is still trapped in that. That's a metaphorical way of thinking about it. That's why it still has emotional significance. So you can write about your past experiences, but I would say wait for at least 18 months if something bad has happened to you, because otherwise you just hurt yourself again by encountering it. You can bring yourself up to date with an autobiography. There's an analysis of faults and virtues, that's the present authoring, and then there's a guided writing exercise that helps you make a future plan. That's young men who do that, to go to college, young men who do that, 90 minutes, just the future authoring, 90 minutes, they're 50% less likely to drop out. That's all it takes. Like I had clients who were so depressed they literally couldn't get out of bed. So what's their first step? It's like, can you sit up once today? No. Can you prop yourself up on your elbows once today? Like you scale back the dragon till you find one that's conquerable, that moves you forward. There's a rubric for life. Scale back the dragons till you find one conquerable, and it'll give you a little bit of gold commensurate with the struggle. But the plus side of that, because you think that, God, that's depressing. You mean I have to start by sitting up? Well, you do if you can't sit up. But the plus side of that is it's the Pareto distribution issue, is that aggregates exponentially increase. And failures do too, by the way, but aggregates exponentially increase. So once you start the ball rolling, it can get zipping along pretty good. This person that I talked about was incapable of sitting with me in a cafe when we first met, just talking, even though I was her therapist. But by the end, she was doing stand-up comedy. So, it took years, but still, most people won't do stand-up comedy. That's quite the bloody achievement. She would read her poetry on stage too. So for someone who was petrified into paralysis by social anxiety and who had to start very small, it was a hell of an accomplishment.
Well, so you're moving from point A to point B in your little circumscribed world. You've made everything invisible. And as long as that works, then your theory's good enough. It's accurate enough. It's true enough. You're in your little paradise. But if something comes up and objects, well, that's where your character is tested fundamentally. That's the character test. It's like, what do you do with messages of error? And that's a tricky issue. Okay, so here's a solution to that. Here's what not to do. I am a bad person. I got to see myself. I'm a bad person. I might as well just go jump off the bridge. It's like, no, that's not good, because what that means is that every time you try to learn something, you're going to make a mistake, because what do you know? So you're going to make mistakes. And if the rule is every time you make a mistake, you're going to go jump off the bridge, then that's not a useful problem-solving strategy. And so when you make a mistake, you don't get to beat yourself to death with a club. It's a bad strategy, and you'll have your internal tyrant in there who's perfectly happy about doing that. That's the, overactive superego that Freud talked about. Maybe it came to you via a parent who was too authoritarian, or a grandparent, or maybe it's just you because you're disagreeable and neurotic, and so you'll take or hyper-conscientious. You'll take yourself apart.
Well, you've got a problem. Something has objected to you. Then the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, maybe you're not looking at the world right. Maybe your goals are wrong. Maybe you're not acting properly. It's okay. So the question that arises when an obstacle emerges is, which part of this structure needs attention? And the first answer can't be all of it, which is why when you're arguing with someone in an intimate relationship and you're angry at them and you want to win, which is a big mistake, you want to win, you say, well, this is what you're like. Here's another 10 examples of how you've done that in the past, and I can enumerate more of them if you'd like. And so that's actually what you're like, and I've tried fixing you and it didn't work, and so it looks like you're going to be like that up into the future, and you're basically saying to them, well, you're a bad person, and the only thing they can do is either collapse or punch you. And punching you is actually better than collapsing. You know what I mean? It's such a counterproductive way of arguing. You don't leave the person any out. And so maybe, well, they're civilized, so it doesn't get physical. Well, maybe that's good and maybe it isn't. But then they end up either really not happy with you in a way that they will manifest the first possible opportunity they get, or they have to go off in the corner and cringe. It's like, great, you won. It's like now your partner's either hates you or is cringing. It's great. That's a real good victory, man. Rack up about 100 victories like that and you'll be in divorce court and spending $250,000 while being miserable about it. Yeah. So anyway, so something objects to you and you think, okay, well, I need to take myself apart, right? Because there's a piece that's broken somewhere. And then you might think, well, let's assume it's a little piece to begin with. That's the right mechanism. It's like, okay, you got a C-. That doesn't prove that you're stupid. Now, it implies that you might be stupid, but it doesn't, right, really, it does, and that's why you don't want to look at it. Maybe it implies that you're lazy, or implies that you're ignorant, or like it implies all sorts of terrible. Might imply that you're a bad person even. But you don't want to leap to that, and that's sort of the proclamation of innocence before guilt. Assume that you're the least amount of reprehensible and ignorant possible. And so then you look at the micro routines. It's okay, well, I got a C- in this course. Maybe I should study for that course 15 minutes more a day for the next 3 months. And then you ask yourself, do you think you could do that? No, I'm too useless. Okay, how about 15 minutes every second day? You think you could do that? You put it in your schedule, like 15 minutes every second day in the morning. And that's, well, you think, well, what's wrong with me? Well, I'm not very good at managing my study schedule. That's not quite down here at the behavioral level, but it's pretty close, because what you can take an action. You can open up your schedule and you can say, oh, I'll mark 15 minutes aside. Then you can practice doing that. It's pretty low level in the hierarchy. It means, well, you're still not a horrible person. You just got to polish up your work ethic. And so what you want to do is it's like the old adage, you got to stand up for yourself, but you don't want to make unnecessary enemies. That's a really good thing to know. It's like, shut the hell up most of the time, but now and then you don't shut up because it's time to say something. You don't want to make unnecessary enemies, though. Well, you don't want to take yourself apart any more than is absolutely necessary. Start little, and you do that with people around you too. Like if you have a child, and the child does something that isn't right, then you think, okay, minimal necessary intervention. What can we do to decrease the probability that that's going to occur in the future? And that's a good thing to know with children. It's also a good thing to know with your partners. You're having an argument with them. It's like, okay, what the hell do you want? What's the minimum thing you can request from them that would satisfy you? And the evil part of your soul is going to be, I want them cringing in a corner. It's like, yeah, get that stuff under control, man. See if you can figure out what that person could offer you that would be minimal that you would accept. And then tell them that. It's like, here's the words I would like you to say in the apology I would like you to formulate, assuming that you think you did something wrong. We have to argue about that because maybe you didn't. But if you did, I want to specify it precisely and narrowly, and I want to give you an escape route. And you might only be able to do it badly because you're still mad. So you apologize half-heartedly. It's like you get a pat on the head for that. Good. Next time it'll be 51%, not half-heartedly. Right? So it's careful training. It's careful training of yourself and other people with the goal in mind, but also with the least amount of harshness possible. And then the other thing to do as well, and this is also true for you, and this is something I learned from studying the behaviorists, is like watch the people around you like a hawk. Whenever they do something that you think is good, you tell them. That's wisdom, man. You'll get so far with that you cannot bloody well believe it, because most people, they're afraid of any number of things. But one of the things they're really afraid of is that now and then they'll creep out of their cynical shell and try to do something good. You know, it's like they're popping out this thing that's unbelievably vulnerable. They'll try to do something good and creep right back into their persona. And they'll look around, see if anyone noticed. And sometimes they'll get punished for it, and then, well, then they won't do it again, so don't do that. But then, now and then you think, hey, I saw you do this. That was actually pretty good. And they think, oh, wow, someone noticed. You know, it's like, wow. And then they'll think, yeah, I could do that again. And if you want to live with someone for a long period of time, I would say every time they do something that you would like them to do more of, number one, notice. Number two, tell them, right? Because I know you don't want to, because you really want to dominate them. And you don't want them thriving, because then they'd be competition to you, and you wouldn't be able to go complain to your mother about what a miserable partner you have, and you know how delightful that is. So you have to forego all that pleasure if you actually helped your person develop. So you got to get over all that. It's really annoying. So you know you've got this person pegged as, yeah, you're stuck with them, and you know maybe it's the best you can do, but you got one eye open. And then every time they do something good, you don't want to notice, because if that elevated them a little bit, you wouldn't be able to feel so resentful and miserable and keep your eye open for the next possible affair. And that is what people are like. That is what people are like, and that's what you're like too. That's what people are like. So you got to decide if that's what you want, or you want to help the person that you're with grow. You know, now it's dangerous because they might outshine you. Well, good. Then you have someone to compare yourself to. That'd be a good deal. It's really rough with kids, you know, because parents will stop their children from succeeding beyond them. They get jealous, and then they'll put them down. And then they have kids that do not like them, and they'll pay for it. It's with our fantasy that we first meet the unknown, right? Well, look, say you're going out with a new person. It's like, what do? You project a fantasy on them, and then you fall in love with the fantasy. And aren't you stupid? Because you're going to find out that the match between your damn fantasy and the actual person is tenuous at best. And so Jung would call that a projection of either the anima or the animus. You know, the anima is what a man projects onto a woman he finds desirable. It's like, oh, she's the perfect woman. It's like, well, how do you know that? You've like seen her for 4 seconds, you know, but it grips you. And the same thing happens in the opposite direction. And it's an action of instinct, you know. It's like you fall in love with the image. But interestingly enough, what you do in a relationship that works is that you actually, I think that what you see, it's a rough approximation, when you project the ideal and fall in love with it, you see what could be. It could be that, but it's going to take you a hell of a lot of work, because like you got no shortage of flaws, and the other person has no shortage of flaws, and so you're bringing your flaws together, and that's going to produce a lot of friction, and you're going to have to engage in a lot of dialogue before you approach that level of perfection again. But maybe you can do it, and then you get to live happily ever after. Well, wouldn't that be nice? Well, so the unconscious meets the unknown, and it meets it with imagination and fantasy and dream and art. That's how you take, see, you don't just go from what you don't know to fully articulated knowledge in one bloody leap. You can't do that. You have to extend pseudopods of fantasy and imagination into the unknown. That's kind of what theorizing is like, right? Even scientifically, you know, you don't know something scientifically, you generate a theory. Well, it's an imaginative representation that your unconscious is helping you generate. And so you meet the unknown with fantasy. That's what the unconscious is for. From the psychoanalytic perspective, that's what dreams do. And you can see why. You dream about the future. You know, it's like, well, what's the future going to be like? Well, you have a little imaginative story going on, and it's like, you don't really create it. It's sort of, you watch it unfold. You know, maybe you can tweak it here and there, but it sort of comes to you from wherever the hell things like that come from. You know, the unconscious, that's the psychoanalytic answer. It's not really much of an answer, because it's more like a representation of a place that we don't understand. But that's where creativity comes from. And I mean, some people are really creative right down to the bloody core. So in my clinical practice, I often see people who are high in openness because they're attracted to me because they watch my lectures. And you have to kind of be high in openness to like my lectures. So because, well, you do, because they go everywhere, you know, and they're not necessarily very orderly. So anyways, lots of my clients are really high in openness, and they're funny people often, especially if they're smart, because sometimes they have the most nihilistic intelligence you can imagine. It's just self-critical and nihilistic and brutally brutal, man, and smart. And so they just criticize themselves out of existence. And so often I have to just try to get them to quit listening to their chattering self-critical rationality and go out and create something, you know, with their massive creativity. And as long as they're doing that, they're engaged in the world and happy as hell. But as soon as that self-critical rationality comes in and shuts down the creativity, they're just like walking corpses, you know. And it's because if you're really open, like you're a tree, and it has some trunks, and you know, your most prominent trait is the most lively trunk. And if you're a creative person and you're not engaging in a creative enterprise, you're like a tree that has had its vitality amputated. And so this is not trivial. This is deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in your biology. And those are people often who have like dream lives you just can't believe. I have one client, he has like 4 spectacular dreams a week, and most of the time we just spend discussing them. I mean, God. And I had another client who could be lucid in her dreams, which is more common among women. She could ask the damn characters what they represented, and they would tell her. It was like, okay, that was pretty weird. And like a lot of the things they told her were really helpful, and they were not things that she wanted to hear. She basically, one of them told her if she was going to live, she'd have to go visit a slaughterhouse. And the reason for that was because she was raised as a little princess and protected from horrible Mother Nature until she hit puberty, in which time she turned into an evil villain, because that's how the family worked. Perfect child, evil teenager, overnight. And then, well, that was hard on her, and she wasn't prepared because she thought the world was princess world, and, you know, she couldn't go through a butcher store without having a fit. And no wonder, you know, like really, Jesus, you know, it's no wonder, but you do it. But she couldn't, so we used to go to butcher stores, and that would make her cry, and that she was a vegetarian, that would make her cry, and, you know, bemoan the cruelty of the world. And it's like, yeah, fair enough, man, those are bloody slabs of meat. It's like, I don't know why everyone isn't screaming when they walk through the butcher store, but you got to get used to it, man, because you can't live in the world otherwise. And so the dream character, who was a gypsy, told her that she had to go visit a slaughterhouse, which seemed rather impractical. And so I asked her if she could think of anything else to do, and she thought, well, why don't we go visit a funeral home and watch an embalming? And I thought, oh, good, that sounds like a fun way to spend a day. And so I phoned up a funeral parlor, and I said I had a client who was terrified of death. Yeah, and I was a therapist who was also a little shaky on the concept myself. And so they had no problem with that. They deal with death all the time, which is really something to think about, right? A human being can actually have an occupation where they do nothing but deal with death, and they don't go stark raving mad. It's like, what the hell's up with that? It's like working in a palliative care ward where your clients that you know have a relationship, all they're going to do is die this week, next week, the week after. People do that. It's like, those people are tough, man. They're tough. So anyways, we went and watched this embalming, which was, I have a rather high level of disgust sensitivity, so it was a little on the rough side for me. But she sat there, and first while she was not, we were outside this little room, she was not looking at that, man, no way. Then she'd kind of go like this, and you know, that was pretty good. And then she'd go like this, and then she'd go like this, and then she watched it. And then she asked if she could go in, and she put on a glove and she touched the body, and she didn't have a fit. She didn't have a panic attack. And so she walked away from there learning that there was a hell of a lot more to her than she thought there was, and that she could see things that she didn't think she could see and live. And after that, she sort of had a touchstone. It's like, well, I'm kind of afraid of this. Well, is it as bad as going to see the embalming? No, it's not that bad. Well, I guess I can do it. It's like an initiation, right? She had an initiation. And so did I, you know. And
I learned a lot from doing that. I learned that one of the things you need to do if you're going to be a human being is to prepare yourself to be useful in the face of death. And so when you have a parent that dies, which, you know, shatters people's ideas, often they can't even think about it. If you can't even think about that, man, you've got some thinking to do, because you need to be able to at least think about that, because otherwise you're just going to be a wasteland when it happens. And you never know, you could even have a higher ambition. Maybe you could even be useful when it happens, instead of being part of the heap of destroyed people who also have to be taken care of. You know, and that's brutal. You have to be brutal to be useful in the aftermath of your parents' death. You know, you don't get to crumble and fall apart, and no, you have every reason to. So you got to be kind of some tough monster to manage that. But do you want to be useful in the face of tragedy, or do you want to be pathetic?